Alaska, the last frontier. Over 665,000 square miles of frozen wilderness where darkness swallows the land for months, and the closest help can be hundreds of miles away. Out here, when something goes wrong, you're on your own. What you're about to hear are 11 accounts from people who encountered something in that isolation, something that defied explanation. Some of these individuals barely made it out. Others, well, their stories are all that remain. I'm Verified Fears, and tonight we're going deep into the Alaskan wilderness, where the cold isn't the only thing that can kill you. The question is, how long can you last before the darkness gets under your skin? Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's step into the frozen unknown, starting with a trucker who discovered that some things hunt beneath the ice. I've been running supply routes across the Brooks Range ice roads for 11 winters now, and I thought I'd seen everything this frozen hell could throw at me. Whiteouts that turned the world into static, temperatures that dropped to 50 below, ice so thin I could hear the river rushing beneath my tires. I'd handled it all. February runs were always the worst, when the darkness was absolute except for your headlights, and the cold was so extreme it could crack your axle if you weren't careful. The route I was running that night connected two villages about 90 miles apart, following the frozen Koyukuk River for most of the distance. It was a road I'd driven dozens of times, hauling everything from fuel to food to medical supplies. The ice was solid, at least 8 feet thick in most places, and I was carrying a lighter load than usual, maybe 70,000 pounds. Everything should have been routine. I left the first village around 11 p.m., which put me in complete darkness for the entire run. That was normal. What wasn't normal was the sound I started hearing about 20 miles in. At first, I thought it was just the usual groaning. Ice does that, especially under the weight of a loaded rig. It shifts and settles and makes these deep bass notes that vibrate through your entire chassis. But this was different. This sounded like it was keeping pace with me. I'd accelerate and the groaning would speed up. I'd slow down and it would match me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the acoustics of driving on a frozen river, sound bouncing weird in the darkness. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight before this run, and fatigue does strange things to your perception. Then I saw the crack. It appeared in my passenger side mirror, a dark line zipper racing across the ice about 30 feet parallel to my truck. I watched it extend forward, keeping perfect pace with my speed. Ice cracks aren't unusual. The freeze-thaw cycle, the weight distribution, the current underneath, all of it creates stress fractures. But cracks don't follow you. They don't anticipate where you're going. I grabbed my radio to call back to base, following protocol. This is Unit 7 to base. I've got some unusual ice activity on the Koyukuk stretch, about mile marker 42. The response came back distorted, overlaid with this deep, rhythmic sound that shouldn't have been on the frequency. Unit, Ven, reading, static, proceed with... Then nothing but that groaning, now coming through my speakers. I killed the radio and focused on driving. The crack was still there, still matching me. I sped up to 45 miles per hour, which was pushing it for ice road conditions, and the crack accelerated with me. I could see it in the sweep of my headlights now, not just in the mirror. It was branching, creating smaller fractures that spread out like veins, all of them oriented toward my truck. My hands were sweating inside my gloves, despite the fact that it was -40 outside. I'd heard stories from old-timers, the kind of stories you laugh off over coffee at the truck stop. Tales about things that lived under the ice, ancient things that predated the villages, that resented the machines that crossed their territory. I'd always figured those stories were just boredom talking, isolation making people see patterns where there weren't any. I made the mistake of stopping. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe that I could inspect the ice, assess the damage, make an informed decision about whether to continue or turn back. The moment my rig came to a complete halt, I felt the ice beneath me shift. Not crack, not break, but shift, like something massive had pressed upward against the underside. The groaning stopped entirely, replaced by a silence so complete it hurt my ears. I sat there in the cab, engine idling, watching my mirrors and the darkness beyond my headlights. That's when I saw the ice in front of me begin to bulge. It rose slowly, a dome of ice about 6 feet in diameter, lifting upward maybe 2 feet before settling back down. Then another bulge appeared, this one closer to my truck, then another. They were forming a line, moving toward me with deliberate purpose. Whatever was underneath was testing, probing, trying to figure out exactly where I was. I slammed the rig into gear and hit the accelerator harder than I should have. The tires spun for a horrifying second before catching, and then I was moving, watching that line of bulges recede in my mirror. But the cracking started again immediately, and this time it was more aggressive. Multiple fracture lines spread out from beneath my truck, some of them cutting across my path ahead. The thing that still bothers me, that I can't explain away with science or fatigue or equipment malfunction, is that the cracks were strategic. They weren't random stress fractures. They were cutting off potential routes, herding me toward deeper sections of the river where the ice would be thinner. I'd studied the maps of this route obsessively. I knew that about 2 miles ahead, the river deepened significantly as it merged with a tributary. The ice there was rated safe, but only barely, and only for lighter vehicles. I was hauling 70,000 pounds. If I went through there, I'd sink in seconds, and in water that cold, I'd have maybe 3 minutes before hypothermia made me useless. I made a decision that violated every safety protocol I'd ever learned. I veered off the established ice road, heading for shallower water where I knew the ice would be thicker. The moment I left the plowed track, my truck started lurching over uneven frozen surface, but I didn't care. Behind me, I could see, and I know how this sounds. I could see the ice actually moving, not cracking, not breaking, but moving like something was swimming underneath it, something so large that it displaced the entire sheet. The fracture lines changed direction, trying to follow me. But I was in the shallows now, where the river had frozen solid all the way to the bottom in places. That's when I got a look at it. My headlights swept across a section of clear ice, the kind that forms in extreme cold without snow cover, and I saw a shape beneath. It was only for a second, maybe less, but that image is burned into my brain like a brand. It looked like a hand, except the fingers were too long, too many joints, and it was easily the size of my entire truck. It was pressing up against the underside of the ice, spread wide like it was feeling for vibrations. The color was wrong too, a pale gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Then I was past that section, bouncing over rough ice, my suspension screaming in protest, my cargo shifting in ways that could tip me if I wasn't careful. The GPS was useless off the marked route, but I had a compass and I knew the general direction I needed to go. I kept to the shallowest sections I could find, areas where the ice met gravel bars, where frozen sandbars created natural bridges. The groaning had started again, but it was different now. Frustrated maybe, if such a thing could feel frustration. The sounds were coming from behind me, receding slightly. Whatever it was couldn't follow as easily in the shallows. It needed depth, needed water underneath the ice to move through. I drove like that for another hour, maybe more. Time loses meaning when you're running on pure adrenaline and terror. Eventually, I recognized landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a stand of black spruce, and I knew I was getting close to the second village. The ice road proper was another quarter-mile to my left, and I risked cutting back toward it. By then, the groaning had stopped completely. Whatever had been following me had either given up or was waiting somewhere I couldn't detect. I made it to the village at 3:30 in the morning, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I filed a report about the ice conditions, mentioned unusual cracking patterns, and recommended that route be inspected before any more heavy loads crossed. The road supervisor told me they'd sent out a crew the next morning and found no structural problems. Ice was solid, thickness well within safety parameters. When I insisted on showing them where I'd driven off-road, they found my tire tracks easily enough. But there was no evidence of the cracking I described, no sign of any disturbance in the ice. They suggested that maybe I'd been out there too long, that maybe I needed to take a few days off. I didn't argue. Here's the thing, though. 2 weeks later, another driver went missing on that exact stretch of the Koyukuk River route. They found his truck 3 days after that, or what was left of it. The ice had given way in a section that should have been solid, and the rig had gone through into 40 feet of water. When they recovered it. The investigators said the ice fractures looked unusual, almost like they'd been created from beneath rather than from the weight above. They ruled it driver error. He must have been speeding, must have hit a weak spot. But I talked to his wife at the funeral, and she told me something that put ice in my veins. She said in his last radio transmission, before the signal cut out, he'd reported something following him under the ice, matching his speed, and he'd sounded terrified. I still run ice roads. It's what I know. It's how I make my living. But I don't take that Koyukuk River route anymore. I request different assignments, different territories. Some guys think I'm superstitious, that I've let one weird night mess with my head. Maybe they're right. But on quiet nights, when I'm crossing other frozen rivers in other parts of the Brooks Range, I sometimes hear that groaning again, deep and rhythmic and almost intelligent. And I press the accelerator just a little harder, keep my eyes on the ice ahead, and I don't stop for anything until I reach solid ground. Because out here in the darkness, on these frozen highways where the nearest help is 100 miles away, you learn to trust your instincts. And my instincts tell me that some things hunt in the deep cold, beneath the ice, waiting for the right moment to pull you down into the black water where no one will ever find you. I accepted the winter assignment at Station 7 because I wanted the isolation. After 3 years of crowded university labs and collaborative research projects where you couldn't think without someone interrupting, the idea of spending 4 months alone on the Arctic coast sounded like paradise. The station itself was a repurposed structure from the 1980s, one of several climate monitoring outposts the university maintained across Alaska's North Slope. My job was straightforward: collect atmospheric data, maintain the equipment, document ice formation patterns along the coast, and transmit my findings via satellite uplink twice weekly. The nearest occupied facility was over 300 miles south. During the polar night, which would last from mid-November through late January, I'd be in complete darkness except for my generator-powered lights. The station consisted of 2 buildings, a main cabin with living quarters and lab space, and a smaller generator shed about 50 feet away. Solar panels supplemented the diesel generator during the brief periods of twilight we got in early winter. But once the polar night settled in completely, I'd be running on fuel reserves and battery banks. I had enough supplies for 6 months if necessary, and a satellite phone for emergencies, though reception was unreliable during magnetic storms. The previous researcher had left detailed logs and maintenance notes, everything meticulously organized. His final entry, dated October 28th, simply read, "Preparations complete. Station ready for winter occupancy. Departing on supply flight." Nothing unusual. Nothing concerning. The first 3 weeks went exactly as planned. I fell into a comfortable routine. Morning equipment checks, data collection, meals I could prepare without thinking, evenings reading or analyzing my findings. The darkness was absolute, the kind of dark that urban people never experience. When I shut off the cabin lights, I literally couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The silence was equally profound. No traffic, no aircraft, no voices, just the occasional groan of sea ice and the whistle of wind across the tundra. I'd expected the isolation to feel oppressive, but instead it felt liberating. For the first time in years, my thoughts were entirely my own. The footprints appeared on December 3rd. I discovered them during my morning perimeter check, a fresh trail in the snow leading directly to the main cabin from the east. They stopped at my door. What disturbed me wasn't their presence. It was their origin. I followed them backward across the snowfield, tracking them for maybe 200 yards before they simply stopped. Not at a vehicle, not at a drop-off point, just stopped in the middle of flat, featureless tundra. There were no corresponding tracks leading away. The prints were human, boot-sized, recent enough that they hadn't been filled in by the constant wind. I checked my security log. No alerts, no motion sensor. Triggers, no unusual activity logged by the automated systems. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the wind had obscured part of the trail. Maybe someone from the university had visited and I'd somehow slept through their arrival, though that seemed impossible given how sound carries in the Arctic silence. I documented the prints with photographs and measurements, then continued my normal routine. That night, I kept the perimeter lights on and checked the security monitors more frequently than usual. Nothing moved in the white circle of illumination surrounding the station. By midnight, I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid. The knocking came at 3:17 a.m. 3 deliberate raps on the main cabin door, loud enough to wake me from sleep. I sat up in my bunk, heart pounding, listening. Silence. Then 3 more knocks, patient and measured. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the door, keeping back from the window. "Who's there?" My voice sounded strange after weeks of not speaking aloud. No response. I checked the security monitor that covered the entrance. The screen showed my door, the small porch, the circle of light from the exterior lamp, but no person. I watched for 5 minutes. Nothing. The wind was calm, less than 5 miles per hour according to my instruments. No conditions that could create knocking sounds. I didn't open the door that night. I sat in my chair, watching the monitor, until dawn began to gray the eastern horizon around 11 a.m. When I finally went outside, there were new footprints on the porch, clear impressions directly in front of the door. But again, no trail leading away. Whoever or whatever had knocked had simply vanished from a porch that stood 4 feet off the ground with no surrounding snowdrifts tall enough to jump into. The second night, the knocking came again at the same time. This time, I was ready. I'd positioned myself with a clear view of both the door and the security monitor. The 3 measured knocks echoed through the cabin. On the monitor, I watched the door, but saw nothing. I counted to 10, then opened it quickly, flashlight raised. A figure stood on the porch, maybe 6 feet away. Male, middle-aged, wearing Arctic gear appropriate for the conditions. He smiled when he saw me. "Thank God," he said. "I've been walking for hours. Can I come in?" Everything about the situation was wrong. His gear was clean, no ice buildup, no signs of exposure despite temperatures that were 30 below zero. His face showed no frostbite, no cold damage. Most critically, there was nowhere he could have walked from. "What station are you from?" I asked, not moving from the doorway. "Station 12, he said, pointing vaguely northeast. "We had a generator failure. I've been trying to reach someone for help." I knew the university's station designations. There was no Station 12. The numbering system only went to 9, and all of them were hundreds of miles from my location. "How do you know my name?" I asked. I hadn't introduced myself, but he'd used it twice already. He looked confused. "You told me. Last week, remember? When you visited our station?" I'd never left Station 7 since arriving. My snowmobile had a GPS tracker, every trip logged automatically. I hadn't gone anywhere. "I think you should leave," I said. The man's expression didn't change, that same pleasant smile. "It's dangerous out there. You know that. Please, just for a few hours." His eyes were wrong. They didn't reflect the light properly, like looking at dark glass instead of human tissue. I shut the door and locked it. Through the monitor, I watched him stand there for maybe 30 seconds, still smiling at the closed door. Then he walked off the porch. And I mean walked off. Not down the stairs, but directly over the edge as if the 4-foot drop didn't exist. He didn't fall, didn't stumble, just stepped down onto the snow with no change in his stride, and walked toward the darkness beyond the lights. I watched until he disappeared. In the morning, I found his footprints approaching the cabin. But the stride length was wrong. Too long, covering ground that would require 6-foot steps. And where he'd stepped off the porch, there was no impact depression, no sign that he'd dropped any distance at all. I spent that day reviewing every file the previous researcher had left. Buried in a folder marked Equipment Manuals, I found a personal journal, dated entries from his winter assignment 2 years prior. Most of it was routine observations. But then I reached December 4th. The visitor returned last night. Same story about needing help, same smile. I've started keeping detailed logs of when it appears. 3:17 a.m. like clockwork. It knows things it shouldn't. Names of my family members, details about my research that aren't in any published papers. Dr. Chen from the university thinks I'm experiencing isolation-induced psychosis. Maybe I am. But psychosis doesn't leave footprints. The entries continued. The previous researcher had documented 17 visits over 3 months. Each time, the figure claimed to be from a non-existent research station. Each time, it knew personal information it shouldn't have access to. The researcher's final entry, dated February 19th, was different from the official log I'd read. "It's wearing my face now. I saw myself standing outside the generator shed tonight. Same jacket I'm wearing, same scar on my left hand. It smiled at me with my smile. I'm requesting early evacuation. I don't care what the university thinks. I'm not spending another night here." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat watching the monitors with the lights on, every setting bright enough to hurt. 3:17 a.m. came and went without incident. I started to relax around 4 a.m. That's when I saw movement on the monitor covering the generator shed. a figure standing next to the building, partially in shadow. It stepped into the light, and I felt my stomach drop. It was me. Exact same build, same hair, wearing identical clothing down to the coffee stain on my thermal shirt that I'd gotten that morning. The figure waved at the camera, a friendly gesture, then walked around the generator shed and out of frame. I checked every monitor. Nothing. I pulled up the security logs. No motion alerts, no anomalies. But I'd seen it. I grabbed the satellite phone and called the university emergency line. The reception was terrible, broken with static. But I managed to communicate that I needed immediate evacuation. The dispatcher said weather conditions made flying impossible for at least 5 days. I'd have to wait. When I asked if they'd sent anyone to check on me, if anyone else had been at this station recently, the answer was definitive no. I was the only person within 300 miles. I made it 3 more nights. The figure appeared each time, always at 3:17, always with a different approach. Once it claimed to be a lost hiker. Once it said it was a supply pilot whose plane had crashed. Once it appeared as my father, who's been dead for 6 years, asking why I hadn't come to visit him. Each time, it knew things. Specific details about my life, my research, my fears that I'd never shared with anyone. Each time, it stood outside the cabin with that patient, expectant expression, as if it was waiting for me to invite it in. The flight came on December 11th. I'd packed 2 days earlier, everything I deemed essential. The pilot took one look at me and asked if I was sick. I must have looked terrible. I hadn't slept properly in a week. During the flight out, I explained what I'd experienced. He listened without commenting, then told me the university had been monitoring my satellite communications and data transmissions. Everything had been normal. No signs of equipment malfunction or environmental factors that could explain hallucinations. He suggested I take some time off, maybe talk to someone. Here's what I didn't tell him. During my last night at Station 7, I was reviewing my security footage, trying to find evidence of what I'd seen. I scrubbed through hours of recordings and found something that I can't explain. On December 3rd, the same day I discovered the first footprints, there's a gap in the footage. 4 minutes and 37 seconds where the timestamp jumps, but the scene doesn't change. During those missing minutes, according to the metadata, the security system recorded 17 separate motion alerts inside the main cabin. I was alone in that cabin. There's no other explanation. Whatever triggered those alerts was inside with me, and I never knew. The university asked me to write a detailed report about my experience at Station 7. I submitted something clinical and brief, mentioned possible equipment issues, and recommended maintenance checks. They accepted it without question. But I know what I saw. I know those footprints were real, that the visitor was real, even if I can't explain what it was or why it appeared. Station 7 is still operational. They sent another researcher there 2 months ago for a summer assignment. I check the university databases sometimes, looking at the data transmissions from that station. Everything appears normal, but when winter comes and the polar night returns, I wonder if that researcher will get a visitor at 3:17 a.m., knocking patiently on their door, smiling with a face that looks almost human, but not quite. And I wonder if they'll be smart enough to never, under any circumstances, invite it inside. My grandfather left me his cabin in his will, along with a handwritten letter that said simply, "Spend time there. Learn to listen. Respect what you hear." He died in March, and by October I'd finally arranged enough time off work to spend a full week at the property. The cabin sat on a small island in Tongass National Forest, accessible only by float plane, about 40 minutes from Sitka. Grandfather had built it himself in the 1970s, back when you could still claim remote land if you maintained it properly. It had been his refuge every autumn for as long as I could remember. The place he disappeared to for weeks at a time, coming back quieter and somehow more settled in himself. I'm half Tlingit on my mother's side. Though I'd grown up in Anchorage, disconnected from most of the cultural traditions my grandfather had tried to teach me. He'd told me stories about the Kushtaka when I was young, shapeshifters that could take human form, land otter men who lured people into the forest and drove them mad. I'd always assumed they were just cautionary tales, the kind every culture has to keep children from wandering too far from safety. Looking back now, I realize how seriously he took those stories, how he never smiled when he told them like he did with other family legends. The float plane dropped me off on a calm afternoon, the pilot helping me unload my supplies onto the small dock grandfather had maintained. "You sure you want a full week out here alone?" he asked. "Weather's supposed to turn in a few days." I assured him I'd be fine. The cabin had a satellite phone for emergencies, and I'd brought enough food for 10 days. He shrugged and handed me his card. "Call when you're ready for pickup. And hey, your grandfather was good people. He knew this forest, respected it. You should do the same." Then he was gone, the sound of the plane's engine fading until there was nothing but wind in the spruce trees and the lap of water against the dock. The cabin was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. One room with a loft, a wood stove, shelves lined with books and field guides, grandfather's tools hanging neatly on the wall. Everything was meticulously maintained despite his absence. Someone must have been checking on it, though the lawyer hadn't mentioned a caretaker. I found grandfather's journals on a shelf, dozens of them dating back decades. I'd planned to read through them during my stay, hoping to feel closer to him, to understand why this place had meant so much to him. The first 2 days were peaceful. I hiked the island's trails, sat on the dock watching ravens, cooked simple meals on the wood stove. In the evenings, I read grandfather's journals by lamplight. Most entries were observations about weather, wildlife, the changing seasons. But scattered throughout were references to the old warnings and keeping the boundaries. One entry from 15 years ago caught my attention. Heard her voice again. Tonight, Catherine calling from the tree line, asking me to come help her with something. Catherine's been dead 8 years. I stayed inside, burned cedar like father taught me. It gave up after an hour, and I heard it leaving, the footsteps changing as it went back into the trees. Catherine was my grandmother. She died when I was 10, long before grandfather built this cabin. I read the entry 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Isolation could affect people strangely. Maybe grandfather had been experiencing auditory hallucinations, his grief manifesting in ways his rational mind couldn't control. But the clinical detachment in his writings suggested otherwise. He documented it like a weather pattern, something expected and manageable if you followed the right protocols. On the 3rd night, I heard my mother's voice. I was getting ready for bed when it came clearly through the cabin wall. "Sweetheart, I need help out here. Can you give me a hand?" The exact tone she used when she needed me to carry groceries or help her reach something on a high shelf. My mother lives in Anchorage, over 800 miles away. I'd spoken to her on the satellite phone that morning. She was fine, dealing with a plumbing issue in her apartment, completely safe. There was no possible way she was standing outside this cabin. I didn't respond. I sat very still on the bunk, listening. The voice came again, slightly different this time. "I know you're in there. Please, I'm hurt. I need your help." Still my mother's voice, but the phrasing was wrong. She wouldn't say it like that, wouldn't use those exact words. I remembered grandfather's journal entry and looked for the cedar he'd mentioned burning. I found bundles of it hanging near the stove, dried and ready. I threw several pieces into the fire, and the cabin filled with a sharp, clean scent. The voice outside stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the stove with grandfather's journals, reading every entry that mentioned the boundaries or the warnings. A pattern emerged. Almost every autumn he'd spent here, something had come to the cabin, trying to lure him outside. It would use voices of people he knew, always someone who was dead or far away. Once it had sounded like his brother, drowned in a fishing accident 30 years prior. Once like his childhood friend, killed in Vietnam. The entities, he never called them Kushtaka directly, but the implication was clear, seemed to know intimate details about his life, using names and phrases that should have been impossible for anything to know. One journal entry included detailed instructions written in a different hand. His father's, I realized, recognizing it from old letters I had seen. When they come speaking with familiar voices, 1. Never answer them directly. 2. Never open the door after dark. 3. Burn cedar and devil's club. 4. Do not look directly at them if you see them. 5. They cannot hold a shape perfectly. Watch for the mistakes. 6. Most important, they cannot enter unless invited. Never, under any circumstances, invite them in. Below this, grandfather had added his own note. Father was right. Followed these rules for 40 years. It's kept me safe. It's kept me human. The next morning, I found tracks circling the cabin. They started as human footprints in the soft ground near the tree line, but as they circled closer to the building, they changed. The stride lengthened impossibly, and the prints themselves became something else. Elongated with claw marks, like an otter's feet but scaled up to human size. Where they reached the cabin wall, they simply stopped. No return tracks, no continuation. Just stopped, as if whatever made them had vanished or passed through solid matter. I took photographs, documented everything, trying to maintain some scientific objectivity. But my hands were shaking. These were exactly like the tracks grandfather had sketched in his journals, detailed drawings with measurements and notes about gait patterns. He'd tracked these things for decades, studying them with the same careful attention he brought to everything else in his life. This wasn't folklore or superstition. This was something real that he'd learned to coexist with by following very specific rules. That afternoon, I heard my grandfather's voice. It came from the dock, calling my name the way he used to when I was a child visiting him in summer. "Come on down here. I want to show you something." The exact tone, the exact inflection. For a moment, grief almost overrode my caution. I wanted so badly to see him again, to hear him explain all of this, to have one more conversation. My hand was on the door handle before I caught myself. I looked through the window instead, angling my view toward the dock. A figure stood there, wearing grandfather's favorite canvas jacket, his old hat. But something was wrong with the proportions. The arms were slightly too long, hanging past where they should have ended. And the face, when it turned toward the cabin, was almost right, but not quite. Like a photograph that had been subtly distorted, all the features in approximately the right places, but the spacing between them just slightly off. "I know what you are," I said aloud, not opening the door. The figure tilted its head, and I heard grandfather's laugh, perfect in every detail. "Smart kid. Your grandmother was worried you wouldn't listen to the old stories. But you're reading the journals, aren't you? Learning what you need to know?" I didn't answer. The figure that looked like grandfather walked closer to the cabin, and I could see its feet now. They weren't quite touching the ground properly, hovering maybe an inch above the dock boards. "Your mother misses you," it said, still using grandfather's voice. "She's very sad. She wants you to come home. She sent me to bring you back." The lies were getting more elaborate, more emotionally manipulative. I remembered grandfather's note about them learning, adapting their strategies. "You need to leave," I said. "You're not welcome here. You're not my grandfather, and you can't have what you're asking for." The figure stopped moving. For a long moment, it just stood there, and I could see its form flickering slightly, like a bad projection. Then it smiled with grandfather's face. But the smile was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. "He fought too," it said, and now the voice was changing, becoming something else, layered with sounds that weren't quite human. "For 40 years he kept us out, but he's gone now, and you're here, and we're so very patient." Then it turned and walked toward the tree line, and I watched its shadow on the ground. The shadow didn't match the form casting it. The shadow was something quadrupedal and low to the ground, otter-shaped, while the figure itself still looked roughly human. I called for early pickup that night. The satellite phone connection was poor, full of static, but I managed to communicate that I needed to leave. The pilot said he could come the next morning if the weather held. I spent that final night burning every scrap of cedar I could find, keeping the fire hot and bright. They came multiple times. I heard my mother, my best friend from college, my deceased aunt, even my own voice calling from outside, asking to be let in, claiming I'd locked myself out. Each time I stayed silent, stayed inside, followed grandfather's rules. Dawn came eventually. The float plane arrived at 9 a.m., and I'd never been more grateful to hear an engine. I loaded my things quickly, taking only my personal items and grandfather's journals. As we lifted off, I looked down at the cabin and saw figures standing at the tree line, 3 of them, maybe 4, watching the plane leave. From the air, they looked almost human. Almost. I've been back in Anchorage for 2 months now. I've read through all of grandfather's journals, understanding now why he spent so much time at that cabin. He wasn't just seeking solitude, he was maintaining the boundaries, proving to those things that the property was actively occupied and defended. Without him there, without someone who knows the rules and follows them, I don't know what will happen to that place. The forest will reclaim it eventually, and maybe that's for the best. Sometimes I hear my grandfather's real voice in my memory, distinguished now from the imitation I heard at the cabin. He used to tell me that the Tlingit stories weren't just entertainment, they were survival guides, accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of people who lived in close proximity to things we don't fully understand. He'd say that dismissing them as superstition was a luxury of people who'd never encountered what the stories warned against. I understand now. I understand completely. And I know that I'll never go back to that cabin, beautiful as it is. Because some inheritances come with responsibilities I'm not prepared to maintain. The forest can have it back. Some places belong to things older than us, and no amount of legal documentation changes that fundamental truth. This was my second season aboard the Northern Prospect, a 120-foot crabber working the Bering Sea out of Dutch Harbor. First season, I'd kept my head down, learned the work, proved I could handle the 18-hour shifts and the brutal conditions. This season, Captain Rourke had told me I was part of the crew proper, not just temporary deck help. We were fishing the continental shelf edge in late October, working the drop-off where the shelf plunges from 200 feet to over 3,000 in the span of a few miles. Good fishing if you knew the bottom, deadly if you didn't. We'd been out 11 days, our holds about 60% full of snow crab, riding out marginal weather and waiting for the next weather window to make another big push. The haul that changed everything came up just after midnight on day 12. We were working a section of bottom that our sonar showed as irregular, probably rocks and debris where crab like to congregate. The net went down to just over 800 feet, deeper than we usually fished. But the captain wanted to try the edge of a trench that showed on our bathymetric maps. Normal drop took about 20 minutes. This one took 40, and when the winch finally started bringing it up, something felt wrong. The tension on the cables was inconsistent, surging and dropping in ways that didn't match any catch pattern I'd seen before. "Heavy?" said Mikey, our lead deckhand, watching the cable strain. Real heavy, or snagged on something. We'd snagged before. Caught the net on rock formations or debris, once on what turned out to be part of a wrecked Japanese fishing vessel from the 70s. But this felt different. The net was moving, coming up steadily, but the resistance kept changing like whatever was in it was shifting position. Captain Rourke came out of the wheelhouse to watch, which he rarely did for routine hauls. When the net broke the surface, we could see it was full, bulging with a normal catch of crab and bottom fish. But there was something else, something large and pale in the center of the mass. We swung the boom over the sorting deck and released the catch. Crabs scattered across the deck in the usual chaos. But that other thing, it hit the deck with a wet, heavy sound that I felt through my boots. For a few seconds, we all just stood there staring at it. It was maybe 7 feet long, roughly humanoid in shape. But that's where any similarity to human anatomy ended. The skeleton was visible through translucent tissue that looked like deep-sea fish skin. You could see the bones moving inside it when it shifted. And it was alive. Whatever this thing was, 800 feet of pressure change hadn't killed it. The head, if you could call it that, was elongated, eyeless, but there were hollows where eyes might have been in some distant evolutionary past. The mouth was a lipless gash filled with needle-fine teeth. But the worst part, the detail that made my skin crawl, was the hands. It had hands. Not flippers, not fins, but articulated fingers. Too many of them, 7 on each hand. And they were moving, touching the deck, exploring with what looked like deliberate curiosity. Jesus Christ, what is that? Mikey backed away from it. Our other deckhand, Tommy, was already on the radio, calling it into the Fisheries Observer program like we were supposed to for unusual catches. The thing's head turned toward the sound of his voice. It had no visible eyes, but it oriented on him with precision, tracking his movement across the deck. That's when I saw it clearly in the deck lights. The eye sockets weren't empty. There was something there, something dark and wet that reflected our lights like oil on water. Captain Rourke approached it carefully, keeping his distance. He'd been fishing these waters for 30 years and claimed to have seen everything the Bering Sea could throw up. "I've never seen anything like this," he said quietly. "It's not in any identification guide I know. We need to get it back in the water. That's protocol for unusual or protected species. Document it, photograph it, get it back in its environment as quickly as possible. But when Mikey and I tried to move it with the deck hooks we used for sharks and large halibut, it responded. The thing grabbed the hook, not defensively, not with the mindless reflex of a fish, but with clear intention. It pulled the hook toward itself, examining it with those too many fingers, turning it over like it was trying to understand what it was for. Then it looked at Mikey. And I know it looked at him, despite having no visible eyes. And it made a sound. Not a fish sound, not an animal sound. A clicking pattern that sounded almost like speech, like it was trying to communicate. Get it off my deck. Captain Rourke's voice had an edge I'd never heard before. Now. We used the deck hose to wash it toward the scuppers, trying not to touch it directly. The thing didn't fight us. It moved with the water, letting itself be pushed toward the side. But the whole time, it was watching us. All four of us, tracking our positions with those invisible eyes. When it reached the rail, it paused, one hand gripping the metal, and I swear it looked back at each of us individually before it dropped into the ocean. We should have left that area immediately. In hindsight, that's obvious. But we had quotas to fill and fuel to justify, and the captain convinced all of us, that it was just some kind of deep sea fish we'd never encountered before. Weird, yes, but the ocean is full of weird things. We'd documented it, we'd released it, we were done. We went back to fishing. That was our first mistake. The next net came up full. Normal catch, nothing unusual. Same with the one after that. We worked through the night, and by dawn we'd added another 8,000 pounds to our holds. Everything seemed fine until Tommy went to check the bait freezer in the lower hold and found one of the access panels removed. Not broken, not torn off. Carefully removed, the bolts laid out in a neat line on the deck beside the opening. The freezer had been accessed from the outside, through the hull. That was impossible. We were 50 miles from land in water that was just above freezing. Captain Rourke inspected the hull from inside. The opening was too small for a person to fit through, maybe 8 inches in diameter. But it went all the way through. He could see water beyond it. "This is a drill hole," he said. "Someone drilled into our hull. But there was no one else out here. No vessels within 20 miles, according to our radar. And the hole was below the waterline. No one could drill a hole below the waterline while we were underway, without us knowing. We patched it with emergency sealant and kept working. But the atmosphere on the boat had changed. Everyone was on edge, jumping at sounds, seeing things in the peripheral vision that weren't there when you looked directly. That night, I had the first dream. I was underwater, deep underwater, and I could breathe. I was swimming down into darkness so complete that I shouldn't have been able to see anything. But I could. I could see the bottom, thousands of feet down. And there were structures there. Not natural formations. Structures, buildings maybe, or something like buildings, made from materials I couldn't identify. And there were things moving between them, lots of things, all shaped like the creature we'd caught. I woke up gasping, but I could still feel the water pressure, still feel the cold. Mikey was awake too, sitting up in his bunk, staring at nothing. "You dream it too?" he asked. I nodded. He described the same dream, exact details, down to the specific geometry of the structures he'd seen. Tommy had dreamed it as well. So had the captain. All of us, the same dream, the same night. The next net came up with 3 of them. Same basic shape as the first, Same translucent skin over visible bones. Same too many-fingered hands. But these three were different. Larger, maybe 9 feet long, and they moved with more coordination. They didn't scramble around the deck like fish out of water. They stood up, balancing on legs that bent in too many places. And they looked at us with those eyeless faces that somehow still conveyed intelligence and intention. The clicking sounds they made back and forth to each other were definitely language. I couldn't understand it, but I could recognize the structure. Question and answer, statement and response. "Back in the water now!" Captain Rourke was shouting, but his voice was shaking. We tried to herd them toward the rail, but they weren't cooperating this time. One of them approached the wheelhouse door, those wrong-jointed fingers touching the handle, testing it. Another moved toward our equipment locker with the same curious examination we'd seen from the first one. They were learning, studying us, figuring out how our world worked. Tommy made the mistake of trying to grab one, thinking he could force it toward the rail. It turned on him with speed that shouldn't have been possible for something that had just come up from 800 feet of depth. It didn't attack him exactly, but it grabbed his arm with those 7-fingered hands and pulled him close, bringing its face within inches of his. The clicking it made was different. Slower, more deliberate, like it was trying to make Tommy understand something. His nose started bleeding immediately, thin streams of blood running down his face, and his eyes went distant. He stopped struggling and just stood there while the thing held him. We got them back in the water eventually, using the deck hoses and making enough noise to drive them toward the rail. But it took 20 minutes, and the whole time they were studying us, learning from us, making those clicking sounds back and forth that definitely carried meaning. When the last one went over the side, it paused like the first one had, looking back at us, and it pointed downward with one of those horrible hands. A gesture, deliberate communication. Then it dropped into the dark water and was gone. Tommy wouldn't talk about what happened when the thing grabbed him. He sat in the galley staring at his coffee for an hour, nose still bleeding intermittently. And when we asked him questions, he just shook his head. Finally, he said, "They want us to come down. They have a message, or an invitation, or I don't know the right word for it. But they want us to come see something. They think we'll understand if we come down there." His eyes were wrong when he said it. The pupils dilated too wide, and his hands were shaking. That night, we all had the same dream again, but more detailed. The underwater city was clearer now, and I could see more of the things moving through it. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. And there were other things too, older structures deeper down, built by something else, something even stranger. In the dream, I understood that these creatures we'd caught were the current residents, but they hadn't built those deepest structures. They'd inherited them or found them, and they wanted to show them to someone, to share what they'd discovered in the deep places where no light had ever reached. Captain Rourke gave the order to head back to Dutch Harbor on day 13. We were only 70% full, well short of our quota, but none of us argued. On the trip back, we didn't talk much. We'd started having the dreams during the day, too. Waking dreams, moments where the boat would disappear and we'd be underwater again, seeing those structures, feeling the pressure and the cold and something else, something calling us down. We've been back on land for 3 weeks now. The fisheries department took our photos and documentation, but they didn't seem particularly concerned. Deep sea life is poorly documented, they said. Probably some kind of undiscovered species of fish. They thanked us for the report and filed it away. None of us have signed on to another boat. We're all having trouble sleeping, having trouble with any kind of normal life. The dreams keep coming, every night now, more vivid and detailed. Last night I dreamed that we were all underwater together, crew and captain, swimming down toward those structures, and the things were waiting for us, welcoming us, showing us doors that opened into spaces that couldn't exist but did. Tommy disappeared 4 days ago. His apartment was found empty, his phone and wallet left behind. The last text message on his phone was to his sister. Going to see what they wanted to show us. Don't worry, it's better down there. The Coast Guard is searching, but I know they won't find him. Or if they do, it won't be anything they can explain. Because I understand now. The things we caught weren't caught at all. They let us haul them up. They wanted to see us, to study us, to establish contact. And now they're calling us, all of us who were on that boat, calling us down to see what they've found in the deep trenches, in places where humans have never gone and maybe were never meant to go. Mikey called me yesterday. He started hearing the clicking sounds when he's alone, that language we heard on the deck. He says he's starting to understand it, that it's getting clearer every day. Captain Rourke put his boat up for sale. He told me on the phone that he can't be on the water anymore, because every time he looks at the ocean, he sees them just beneath the surface, dozens of them, watching and waiting. I look at the ocean too, here in Dutch Harbor where I'm writing this. I can see them sometimes in my peripheral vision, pale shapes moving just below the waves. And the worst part is that I'm not scared anymore. The dreams have shown me what's down there, and part of me, a growing part, wants to see it for real, wants to accept their invitation and swim down into that darkness where they're waiting to show us what they've found, what they've been living with for who knows how long in the deep places we never knew existed. The water's cold here, barely above freezing. But I don't think that will matter once I'm underneath it, once I'm with them. I think it will feel like coming home. I've been studying wolf behavior in Alaska for 7 years. The last 3 focused on a specific pack in Denali National Park. My research station was positioned about 30 miles into the backcountry, accessible only by snowmobile in winter. A small cabin equipped with computer systems for analyzing GPS collar data and trail camera footage. The pack I was monitoring, designated as the Teklanika pack, consisted of 9 wolves, 5 of which wore GPS collars that transmitted location data via satellite every 4 hours. Standard research protocol. I'd done this work with multiple packs across different regions, published papers on predation patterns and territorial behavior. I thought I understood wolves, understood the limits of their intelligence and social organization. December 2024 taught me how wrong I was. The first anomaly appeared in the GPS data on December 8th. I was reviewing the overnight location pings when I noticed something unusual about the pack's movement pattern. Normally, wolves travel in relatively loose formations when hunting, spreading out to cover more ground, then converging on prey. But these coordinates showed the pack moving in a perfect geometric grid pattern across a 2-square-mile area, each wolf maintaining exactly the same distance from the others, the entire formation shifting as a single coordinated unit. I ran the data through my analysis software 3 times, checking for equipment malfunction or satellite error. The pattern was real. I pulled up the historical data for comparison. The Teklanika pack had never moved like this before. No pack I'd studied had ever moved like this. The precision required would demand a level of communication and spatial awareness that wolves simply don't possess. I made notes in my research log, flagged the data for further analysis, and tried to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe they'd been hunting in an area with unusual terrain features that channeled their movement. Maybe the GPS collars were malfunctioning in synchronized ways, though the probability of that was essentially zero. The second anomaly came 2 days later. My trail cameras, positioned at various points around the research station and near known wolf travel corridors, captured footage that made me review the recordings frame by frame for hours. The wolves had approached one of my cameras. Not unusual, they're curious animals. But instead of sniffing it and moving on, they appeared to be examining it systematically. The alpha female spent nearly 4 minutes looking directly at the lens, then at the solar panel, then at the mounting bracket. She touched the camera housing with her nose in specific spots, like she was testing its construction. Then the beta male approached and did the same thing, touching the exact same spots in the exact same sequence. That could have been coincidence, learned behavior from watching the alpha. Wolves are intelligent, they learn from pack leaders. But then a third wolf approached and performed the same examination, touching the same specific points in the same order. Then a fourth. All 9 wolves, including the 3 without GPS collars, examined that camera in identical fashion, like they were following a protocol. The footage timestamp showed this took place over 47 minutes. When they finished, they sat in a semicircle facing the camera for 3 minutes, completely still, then moved off in single file. I spent that evening reviewing everything I knew about wolf cognition and social learning. They're smart animals, capable of complex problem-solving and coordinated hunting strategies. But this level of systematic behavior, this precision in replicating actions, was outside documented parameters. I considered that I might be anthropomorphizing, seeing patterns that weren't really there because human brains are wired to find patterns. I made myself coffee and tried to focus on the mundane work of data entry and equipment maintenance. December 12th. I discovered bone arrangements. During my weekly perimeter check around the research station, I found caribou bones laid out in patterns around my cache shed. Not scattered by scavengers, not dragged and dropped randomly, arranged. Ribs forming parallel lines, leg bones positioned at right angles, vertebrae placed at regular intervals. The patterns were too precise to be natural. I photographed everything, took measurements, documented the positions. The bones formed what looked like a simplified diagram of the research station itself, with specific markers where my cabin, generator shed, and cache were located. I checked the trail cameras covering that area. The footage showed the wolves arranging the bones over the course of 3 hours, working in pairs, moving specific bones to specific locations. They weren't playing, weren't food caching, weren't engaging in any documented wolf behavior I'd ever seen. They were constructing something, building a model, and the precision with which they worked suggested planning and spatial reasoning that should have been impossible. That's when I started to feel genuine unease. I'd been in remote research stations before, alone for months, and never felt threatened by the wildlife I studied. But this was different. This suggested the wolves weren't just aware of me. They were studying me back, analyzing my environment, perhaps trying to understand my presence and purpose. I increased the frequency of my GPS data downloads, checking the collar transmissions every 2 hours instead of the standard 4. The movement patterns became more complex. The wolves began traveling in formations that I recognized from my own field research methodology. They were grid searching, the same systematic pattern researchers use to survey an area thoroughly. They covered a 12-square-mile section of territory in perfect search grids over 4 days. The GPS data showing coverage so complete there were no gaps larger than 100 meters. This wasn't hunting behavior. This was methodical survey work, December 15th. My motion sensors started triggering in patterns. The research station had a perimeter security system, basic infrared sensors that logged when something larger than a fox passed within 50 meters. Over the course of one night, the sensors triggered in sequence, clockwise around the station, one every 17 minutes for 6 hours. Whatever was tripping them was circling my position with mathematical regularity. I reviewed the trail camera footage and saw individual wolves, each making exactly one circuit around the station before disappearing into the darkness. They were taking turns, maintaining continuous surveillance. I called my research supervisor via satellite phone and described what I was observing. She listened patiently, then suggested that wolves were simply establishing territorial behavior around a potential competitor. Me. It was a reasonable explanation. I wanted to believe it. But it didn't account for the precision, the geometric patterns, the systematic approach. Those weren't territorial displays. Those were intelligence-gathering operations. The next development was the most disturbing. I discovered the wolves were testing my security measures. I had a standard electric fence around the generator's shed. Low voltage, enough to deter curious animals from tampering with fuel supplies. The trail camera covering that area showed a wolf approaching the fence, touching its nose to the wire, receiving the shock, and backing off. Normal animal behavior. But then a second wolf approached the exact same spot, received the same shock, and backed off. Then a third, fourth, fifth. All 9 wolves, one after another, deliberately touching the fence in the same location, as if they were gathering data about the deterrent's strength and consistency. Later that same day, I found they'd been probing the fence at different points, testing multiple locations, and they discovered that the corner post had a small gap where the wire didn't quite connect. They didn't breach the fence. They just identified the weakness and left it alone, like they were creating a database of vulnerabilities for future reference. I started keeping detailed hourly logs of my observations. December 17th, so 300 hours. Wolves positioned at exactly the cardinal points around the station, north, south, east, west. Maintaining those positions for 40 minutes. December 17th, 1400 hours. 2 wolves observed on ridge overlooking the station, sitting motionless for 2 hours, line of sight covering all my approaches. December 18th, over 200 hours. Discovered fresh wolf tracks leading to every single one of my trail cameras, including 3 I'd installed just days earlier in locations the pack had never visited before. They'd found them all in one night. The GPS collar data was showing something else troubling. The wolves were spending significant time in locations that had no obvious value. No prey concentrations, no den sites, no territorial boundaries to defend. When I cross-referenced these locations with my own research activities, I realized they were places I'd visited recently. They were following my movements, checking locations where I'd conducted surveys or collected samples. They were backtracking me, learning my routines. December 19th. I found a wolf waiting by my snowmobile. I'd left it parked about 100 meters from the cabin while I checked equipment. When I came back, the alpha female was sitting beside it, not aggressive, not afraid, just sitting there like she was waiting for me. We made eye contact for maybe 30 seconds. Her expression, and I know how unscientific this sounds, her expression was evaluative. She was assessing me, making some kind of judgment. Then she stood up, walked a slow circle around the snowmobile, came back to her original position, looked at me again, and trotted off into the trees. I checked the snowmobile thoroughly. Nothing was damaged, nothing disturbed. But there were nose prints on the seat, on the handlebars, on the storage compartment. She'd examined it while waiting for me, testing materials, learning about my tools, my methods of transportation. That night, I reviewed all my footage, all my data, looking for an explanation that fit within known wolf behavior parameters. I couldn't find one. Every observation pointed to the same conclusion. This pack had developed or was developing cognitive abilities beyond normal wolf intelligence. Tool recognition, systematic testing, geometric precision in movement, coordinated surveillance. These were strategies that suggested either directed training from an outside source or spontaneous evolution of higher-order thinking. The most frightening possibility was that they were being directed. The bone arrangements, the synchronized camera examinations, the perfect grid patterns. What if something else was controlling them, using them as proxies to study me? But that led to questions I couldn't answer. What could control 9 wild wolves with that level of precision? And why would it be interested in a wildlife researcher in the middle of Denali? December 21st. The wolves changed tactics. Instead of circling the station, they began approaching directly, one at a time, coming within 20 meters of my cabin before stopping. Each wolf would arrive, sit for exactly 10 minutes facing the cabin, then leave. Another would arrive 17 minutes later, repeat the process. They maintained this pattern for 14 hours. I watched from the window, documenting each visit, and I realized they were demonstrating something: patience, organization, the ability to maintain a coordinated strategy over extended time. The GPS data from that day showed me something that made my hands shake when I mapped it. While individual wolves were visiting the station in sequence, the rest of the pack was positioning themselves in a large perimeter around my location. They'd formed a circle approximately 1 mile in radius, with my station at the exact center, and they maintained that formation for the entire 14 hours. Military-level coordination, strategic positioning. They were showing me they could isolate me, that they controlled the space around the research station. I made the decision to leave on December 22nd. I submitted my data to the university servers, packed essential equipment, and prepared for extraction. The satellite phone call to arrange pickup was difficult. My supervisor was concerned about abandoning an active research site. Wanted me to wait for scheduled rotation in 3 weeks. I couldn't explain the real reason I was leaving without sounding irrational. I told her equipment failures, personal health concerns, anything that sounded more reasonable than, "The wolves have been conducting surveillance operations against me with tactical precision." The night before extraction, the wolves made their final demonstration. All 9 gathered in front of my cabin, clearly visible in the exterior lights. And they performed the most unsettling display yet. They arranged themselves in a line, shoulder to shoulder, facing the cabin directly. For 23 minutes, they remained perfectly still. Perfect formation, just watching. Then, in synchronized movement that would have been impressive in trained dogs, they turned 90 degrees to the right, held that position for exactly 1 minute, turned another 90 degrees, held again, until they'd completed a full rotation. Then they dispersed, each taking a different direction, moving away in straight lines that radiated out from the cabin like spokes from a wheel hub. I watched the GPS data update as they moved. The straight line paths they followed extended for over 3 miles each before they finally broke formation. It was a demonstration, a message. They were showing me they could execute complex coordinated maneuvers, that their behavior was intentional and controlled, not instinctive or random. The helicopter picked me up on December 23rd. As we lifted off, I looked down at the research station and saw wolves on every ridge point surrounding it, sitting motionless, watching the extraction. The GPS collars have continued transmitting data. and I've continued analyzing it from the university. The pack's behavior has returned to normal parameters. Standard hunting patterns. Typical territorial movement. Nothing unusual. Like whatever was driving that extraordinary behavior has been turned off or is dormant. I submitted my findings in a carefully worded report that focused on anomalous GPS data requiring further investigation and potential equipment calibration issues. The university accepted it and assigned someone else to continue monitoring the Teclonica pack. I didn't warn them. How could I? What would I say that wouldn't sound like isolation-induced paranoia or complete professional breakdown? But I keep watching the data. Every day, I download the GPS coordinates, looking for those geometric patterns, those perfect formations. And sometimes, late at night when I'm analyzing the movement maps, I see hints of it. Brief moments where the pack moves with too much precision, where their positions suggest coordination beyond instinct. And I wonder what they were showing me, what they wanted me to understand. Were they demonstrating intelligence they've always had, but kept hidden? Or was something else using them, testing human response through animal proxies, running experiments in the wilderness where no one would believe what was observed? The researcher who took over my station called me last week. She wanted to ask about my methodology, about how I'd conducted my observations. I asked why, and there was a long pause before she answered. "The wolves," she said. "They keep arranging bones around the cache shed. Perfect geometric patterns, like they're building something or communicating something." I told her it was probably normal scavenging behavior. Nothing to worry about. I told her to document it and continue standard research protocols. I didn't tell her to leave. I probably should have. Because if the wolves are doing it again, with a different researcher, that means it wasn't about me specifically. It means they're studying us, all of us. And whatever intelligence is guiding that study has patience enough to work across multiple human subjects, gathering data, learning how we respond, waiting for the right moment to show us exactly what they've become. I've been flying supply routes across Alaska for 15 years, accumulated over 8,000 hours in Cessnas, beavers, and otters. Most of it in conditions that would ground pilots in the lower 48 without a second thought. You learn to read weather that changes by the minute, to navigate by landmarks when GPS signals drop out in the mountains, to land on gravel strips that are barely longer than your wingspan. The job requires constant risk assessment and a healthy respect for how quickly things can go wrong up here. Weather, mechanical failure, navigation error. Any one of them can kill you if you're not paying attention. What happened to me on November 14th, 2024, doesn't fit into any of those categories, and that's what keeps me awake at night. The flight was routine. Cargo run from Sitka to a mining operation near the Canadian border, about 240 miles as the crow flies. I was in my Cessna 206 on floats, weather forecast showing scattered clouds with visibility decent for November. I'd flown this route dozens of times, knew every mountain peak and river valley, every landmark I needed to stay on course. The cargo was standard mining supplies, nothing heavy, well within weight limits. I filed my flight plan, did my pre-flight check, and took off at 7:30 with an estimated arrival time of 10:15. The first hour was textbook. I followed the inside passage north, then cut inland toward the mountains, climbing to 8,500 feet to clear the passes. Visibility was good, maybe 8 miles, and I was making decent time with a slight tailwind. I checked in with flight service at the 1-hour mark, reported position and conditions, everything nominal. The controller acknowledged and told me to have a safe flight. That was the last normal radio transmission I made. About 90 minutes into the flight, the weather started changing. Clouds moved in faster than the forecast predicted, dropping the ceiling from scattered to broken in less than 15 minutes. Not unusual for Alaska. The forecasts are educated guesses at best in the mountain regions. I descended to stay VFR, keeping visual contact with the terrain, following a valley I'd used before that led through the mountain range. The valley was familiar territory, a natural corridor between peaks that saved 20 miles versus going around. That's when things started feeling wrong. The valley looked right, same approximate width, same general orientation, but details were off. The tributaries feeding into the main river weren't in the positions I remembered. There was a waterfall on the south wall that shouldn't have been there. I checked my GPS, and the coordinates showed I was exactly where I should be. But what I was seeing didn't match my memory or my charts. I told myself it was the lighting, the cloud cover changing how things looked. Maybe I'd gotten turned around and entered a different valley that ran parallel. But my compass heading was correct. My GPS coordinates matched my flight plan. I should have been looking at familiar terrain, but nothing felt familiar. The wrongness was subtle but persistent, like looking at a photograph that's been slightly distorted. All the elements are there, but the proportions are off. Then the clouds closed in completely, and I was in a whiteout. 1 second I had forward visibility, the next I was flying in absolute white. No horizon, no ground reference, no sky, just uniform brightness in every direction. Whiteout conditions are deadly. You lose all depth perception, all sense of orientation. Pilots have flown perfectly functional aircraft into the ground in whiteouts because they literally couldn't tell up from down. I immediately went to instruments, trusting my altimeter and attitude indicator rather than my senses. Protocol says climb to a safe altitude and get out of the valley, but my instruments were acting strange. The altimeter was spinning, rising, and falling randomly. The compass was rotating slowly but continuously, like I was in a constant turn even though the attitude indicator showed wings level. The GPS display flickered, showing coordinates that jumped hundreds of miles with each update. 1 second I was over southeast Alaska, the next over the Bering Sea, then back to somewhere in the Brooks Range. I tried the radio. Sitka Flight Service. This is Cessna November 73 Delta Mike. I'm experiencing instrument malfunctions and whiteout conditions, requesting vectors to nearest suitable landing area. Static. I tried again. More static, but underneath it, something else. A rhythmic pattern that didn't sound like normal interference. It almost sounded like Morse code, but too fast, too complex, and it wasn't following any pattern I recognized. The engine was running smoothly, fuel quantity showing normal, all systems operational except navigation and communication. I had maybe 2 hours of fuel remaining, enough to backtrack if I could figure out which direction to go. But without reliable instruments, without visual reference, without radio contact, I was essentially blind and deaf in the middle of a mountain range. I made the decision to descend slowly, trying to get below the whiteout layer. I dropped at 200 feet per minute, watching the altimeter when it was showing steady numbers, and praying I'd break out into clear air before I hit terrain. At what the altimeter claimed was 4,800 feet, the white started breaking up. I could see shapes below me, dark forms that resolved into ground features. What I saw when I came out of the whiteout made my hands tighten on the yoke. I was in a valley, but it wasn't the valley I'd entered. The geography was wrong, not slightly off, but fundamentally different. The mountains surrounding me were shaped wrong, too symmetrical, like they'd been placed deliberately rather than formed by geological processes. The river below ran too straight, maintaining perfect consistency and width for miles. And there were structures. They looked like buildings, but the architecture was wrong. Angles that didn't quite make sense. Proportions that seemed to shift when I looked at them from different directions. They were massive, some of them covering several acres, built from material that reflected the dim light in ways that metal and concrete don't. The structures were arranged in geometric patterns, perfectly spaced, connected by what might have been roads, but were too wide and ran in perfectly straight lines, regardless of terrain. I checked my GPS again. The display now showed coordinates that placed me 47 miles east of my planned route, in an area my charts indicated as unpopulated wilderness. But I was looking at what appeared to be a settlement, or a facility, or something that suggested intelligent design and large-scale construction. Nothing on this scale existed in this region. I would have known about it, would have seen it on satellite imagery, would have heard about it from other pilots. I circled lower, trying to get better visibility, trying to understand what I was seeing. There was no sign of activity, no vehicles, no lights, no movement. The structures just sat there in their precise geometric arrangements, massive and silent. My watch showed 0945. I'd been flying for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Should have been close to my destination. Instead, I was somewhere that shouldn't exist, looking at architecture that made no sense. That's when I noticed my fuel gauge. It still showed nearly full, about the same level it had shown 30 minutes earlier. Fuel gauges can malfunction, can stick, but mine had been working fine during pre-flight and early flight. I checked my watch against the panel clock. They disagreed by 15 minutes. My watch showed 0945. The panel clock showed 1000. Both were accurate when I'd taken off. I'd synced them as part of my pre-flight routine. I tried climbing out of the valley, wanting to get above it, to see if I could orient myself by finding familiar landmarks beyond the ridges. As I climbed, the whiteout closed in again. And when I tried to turn back, I found myself descending back into the same valley from a different direction. I tried 3 more times, each attempt ending the same way. Whiteout conditions forcing me back down, emerging into the valley I couldn't escape. My 4th descent brought me out over a different section of the valley, and I saw something that made my chest tighten. My plane. My exact plane. Same registration number visible on the fuselage, flying the same pattern I'd just flown, maybe 2 miles ahead of me. I watched it climb toward the ridgeline, disappear into the white, then emerge back in the valley exactly as I had done. I was watching myself from 10 minutes ago, or 10 minutes in the future, or from some perspective that didn't follow normal time. I pulled back on the throttle and slowed to minimum safe airspeed, letting the other aircraft, my aircraft, pull ahead. It continued the pattern, climbing and descending, trapped in the same loop I was experiencing. How many times had I already done this? How long had I been circling this valley, running the same pattern, seeing myself from different temporal positions? The fuel gauge still showed full. My watch and the panel clock now disagreed by 47 minutes. The radio continued emitting that strange, rhythmic static that might have been communication in a language I didn't understand. And the structures below remained perfect and silent, and geometrically impossible. I remembered my survival training. When you're lost, when systems are failing, when nothing makes sense, you go back to basics. I shut off the GPS, ignored the compass, stopped looking at the time discrepancies. I focused on the sun position, barely visible through the clouds, and I used it to establish a direction. East. I'd fly east until I hit the coast or ran out of fuel, whichever came first. I pushed the throttle forward and committed to the heading, not deviating regardless of what the instruments showed or what I saw below. The whiteout tried to close in again. but I climbed above it this time, breaking through at what I estimated was 11,000 feet into clear air and sunlight. Below me, an unbroken cloud deck stretched to the horizon. Above, perfect blue sky. No landmarks, no reference points, just white below and blue above. I flew for what my watch said was 90 minutes, though the panel clock indicated only 20 minutes had passed. The fuel gauge fluctuated randomly between full and 3/4. Then I saw a break in the clouds ahead, and through it I recognized terrain, the actual terrain from my charts, the mountains I knew, the valleys I'd flown hundreds of times. I descended through the gap and found myself exactly where my original flight plan said I should be, 10 miles from my destination. The mining operation appeared ahead, the gravel strip where I'd landed dozens of times before. I set up my approach, touched down smoothly, and taxied to the parking area. The facility manager came out to help with the cargo unload. "Thought you might turn back," he said. "Weather got pretty thick about an hour ago." An hour ago. My watch showed I'd been flying for 4 hours and 32 minutes. The panel clock showed 2 hours and 40 minutes. The facility manager's timestamp on the cargo receipt showed I'd landed at 11:45, right on schedule according to my original flight plan, as if nothing unusual had happened. I didn't mention the valley or the structures or the temporal discrepancies. I helped unload the cargo, accepted payment, filed my return flight plan. The flight back to Sitka was completely normal. Clear weather, accurate instruments, no anomalies. I landed at 15:30, tied down the aircraft, completed my paperwork. That night, I reviewed my charts, trying to find the valley I'd been trapped in. I couldn't identify it. Every valley in that region was mapped, documented, photographed. None of them matched what I had seen. I checked satellite imagery going back 5 years. No sign of structures, no geometric patterns, no evidence that anything unusual existed in that airspace. I talked to other pilots over the next few weeks, casual conversations at the flight service station, asking if anyone had experienced navigation issues in that region. 2 pilots mentioned strange instrument behavior in the same general area. One described a valley that didn't look right, but couldn't be more specific. Another said his GPS had malfunctioned for about 20 minutes before correcting itself. None of them reported seeing structures or experiencing time discrepancies. I've flown that route 3 times since November. Each time, I've tried to find the valley again, tried to recreate the conditions that led me there. I haven't succeeded. The geography is normal. The instruments work perfectly. The flights are routine. But I carry extra fuel now, and I've started keeping a backup watch that I check against the panel clock every 15 minutes. And I pay attention to the fuel gauge in ways I never did before, watching for inconsistencies that might indicate I'm slipping into that other place again. The question that haunts me isn't what I saw. I can almost rationalize that as hallucination, instrument failure, some combination of stress and environmental factors. The question is when. Was I actually trapped in that valley for hours while time passed normally outside it? Or did I experience subjective hours while only minutes passed in the real world? The conflicting time displays suggest both were happening simultaneously, different time streams existing in the same physical space. And those structures, if they were real, if that valley exists in some parallel version of Alaska's geography, what were they? Who built them? Are they still there? Just outside the normal flow of time and space, waiting for pilots who enter the wrong weather conditions at the wrong moment in the wrong valley? I check my GPS coordinates obsessively now during every flight, documenting my position every 5 minutes, looking for discontinuities, for moments where the numbers jump or the instruments disagree with reality. Last week, I was reviewing my flight recorder data from that November trip. Most of it was corrupted. But there's one clear section from when I was in the valley. The altitude readings show me at 4,800 feet for 17 minutes. But the GPS coordinates during that same 17 minutes place me at 93 different locations, some of them over 1,000 miles apart. According to the data, I was simultaneously in Southeast Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, and northern Canada at the same altitude, at the same time. The flight recorder doesn't malfunction like that. It doesn't hallucinate. It records what the instruments report. I keep that data on a backup drive now, haven't shown it to anyone. What would I say? That I flew into a valley that exists in multiple places at once, where time runs at different speeds, where massive structures built by unknown hands sit waiting in perfect geometric patterns. That I saw my own aircraft from a temporal perspective that shouldn't be possible. I'd lose my license, maybe end up in psychiatric evaluation. Better to keep flying, keep documenting, keep watching for the moment when the instruments start disagreeing and the fuel gauge stops making sense. And the valley that wasn't there appears again in my windscreen, offering entrance to a place where the normal rules of physics and time have no meaning. I was contracted by the Forest Service in August 2024 to conduct preliminary environmental assessments at several abandoned mining sites across Prince of Wales Island. The Ross Adams mine on Boken Mountain was my third site that month, a former uranium-thorium operation that had been shuttered since 1971. The assignment was straightforward environmental geology work: survey the tunnel systems, collect rock and water samples for radiological testing, document structural integrity, assess contamination levels for the upcoming remediation project. Standard procedure for abandoned mine sites, nothing I hadn't done dozens of times across Alaska and the lower 48. The mine itself was accessed via boat from Ketchikan, about 40 miles by water, then a 2-mile hike up the slopes of Boken Mountain through dense Tongass rainforest. The site showed obvious signs of decades of abandonment. Rusted equipment half buried in moss, collapsed outbuildings, the open pit partially filled with rainwater. Radiation levels at the surface were elevated but manageable with proper equipment, ranging from 2 to 5 times background depending on proximity to exposed ore veins. I was equipped with dosimeters, Geiger counter, full protective gear, and communication equipment, including a satellite phone with GPS beacon in case of emergency. The tunnel system extended approximately 1,800 feet into Boken Mountain, across 3 main shafts and numerous smaller exploratory tunnels. Historical records indicated mining operations had reached depths of 400 feet below the surface at the deepest points. My job was to map the accessible sections, identify structural hazards, and collect samples from various depths to assess groundwater contamination and residual radiation levels. I expected to spend 3 days completing the survey work. The first anomaly appeared on my second day underground, about 1,100 feet into the main shaft. I was collecting core samples from exposed granite when I noticed something unusual about the rock temperature. Standard geothermal gradient predicts temperature increases of roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit for every 70 feet of depth. At 400 feet down, the rock should have been noticeably warmer than surface temperature, probably around 55 to 60 degrees. Instead, my contact thermometer showed 48 degrees, colder than it should be at that depth, colder even than the ambient tunnel temperature. I took multiple readings to confirm. Same result. The granite itself was somehow cooler than the surrounding air. I documented it in my field notes and continued the survey, thinking perhaps there was groundwater circulation I hadn't detected that was carrying away heat. But as I moved deeper into the tunnel system, the temperature discrepancy became more pronounced. At the furthest extent of the main shaft, The rock was registering 42 degrees, despite being at the maximum depth of the mine. The second anomaly was the Geiger counter readings. They weren't behaving as expected. Uranium deposits don't pulse. They emit radiation at relatively constant rates based on the concentration of radioactive isotopes. But my readings were fluctuating in patterns, not randomly but rhythmically. I'd get a spike, then a decline, then another spike. Consistent intervals of about 17 seconds. I checked the equipment, changed batteries, verified calibration. The pattern continued. I set up continuous monitoring at several points in the tunnel system and discovered something that made no geological sense. The radiation pulses were synchronized across all monitoring points. The spikes occurred at the same moment throughout the mine, regardless of proximity to ore veins. That's not how radiation works. Different veins with different concentrations should show different emission patterns. But somehow, all the uranium in the mountain was fluctuating in perfect synchronization. On the third day, I was working in one of the deeper exploratory tunnels that branched off from the main shaft when I heard the sound. It was low frequency, barely at the edge of hearing, a deep rhythmic pulse that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. I checked my watch. The pulses occurred every 17 seconds, matching the radiation fluctuations exactly. The sound was coming from deeper in the mountain, from sections beyond where the mining operations had reached. I consulted the historical mining records I'd brought. The deepest exploratory drilling had reached 600 feet, but those deep holes had been sealed decades ago. The accessible tunnels only extended to 400 feet maximum depth. But the sound was definitely coming from below, from somewhere the mining operations had never accessed. I made the decision to investigate further, knowing it was probably outside my contract scope, but unable to ignore clear evidence of anomalous geological activity. There was a sealed tunnel at the end of one of the exploratory shafts, marked on the old maps as abandoned, unstable. The concrete seal was cracked, and I could feel air movement through the gaps, a slight breeze flowing outward from behind the barrier. That shouldn't be possible in a sealed tunnel. I measured the airflow. Consistent pressure differential suggesting the tunnel connected to a larger cavity system. And the air was warm, contradicting the temperature readings I'd been getting from the rock. I contacted my supervisor via satellite phone and described what I'd found. She was concerned about me entering an unstable area alone, but agreed that the temperature anomalies and radiation patterns warranted investigation. We established a check-in protocol. I'd call every 2 hours, and if I missed a check-in, they'd initiate emergency response. I documented my decision in the field log, then carefully removed enough of the concrete seal to squeeze through. Beyond the barrier, the tunnel continued for another 100 feet before opening into a natural cavity. My headlamp illuminated a space much larger than the mining tunnels, maybe 60 feet across, the ceiling lost in darkness above me. The walls showed no sign of mining activity. This was a natural formation, a void within the mountain that the mining operations had accidentally intersected. The rock here was different, darker, with veining patterns I didn't recognize. The temperature was significantly warmer, maybe 70 degrees, and the air had a distinct mineral smell. My Geiger counter was reading higher here, but still following that 17-second pulse pattern. I collected rock samples from the cavity walls and noticed something strange about the stone. It was slightly warm to the touch, warmer than ambient air temperature, and when I pressed my hand against it, I could feel vibration, subtle but definitely present, rhythmic, matching that 17-second interval. I explored the cavity's perimeter and found 3 additional tunnels leading away into darkness, all natural formations, none showing evidence of human activity. I chose the widest tunnel and followed it downward, descending at what I estimated was a 20-degree angle. My GPS unit was malfunctioning underground, but I maintained careful notes about distance and direction, standard practice for cave exploration. The tunnel extended much farther than I'd anticipated. After 30 minutes of descent, I estimated I was at least 600 feet below the mine's deepest shaft, possibly deeper. The rock temperature continued to increase, now approaching 80 degrees, and the vibrations I'd felt in the cavity were more pronounced here. The tunnel walls pulsed rhythmically. Expansion and contraction I could see in the beam of my headlamp. That's when I realized what I was feeling wasn't geological activity. It was biological. The mountain was breathing. The 17-second intervals weren't radiation pulses or seismic tremors. They were respirations. Something massive, something that filled the deep spaces beneath Bocan Mountain, was alive and breathing, and I was standing inside it. I stopped moving and forced myself to think rationally. Geological formations don't breathe. There had to be another explanation. Gas pressure variations, geothermal activity, tidal effects on groundwater systems. But none of those explanations fit the data. The regularity was too perfect, the synchronization too precise. And the rock itself was warm in ways that had nothing to do with geothermal gradients. I should have turned back immediately. Professional protocol says when you encounter unexplained phenomena underground, you retreat, document, report, and return with appropriate equipment and support. But I kept going, driven by the same impulse that makes scientists point instruments at things they don't understand. I needed to see what was deeper, needed to understand what I'd discovered. The tunnel opened into another cavity, much larger than the first. My headlamp couldn't reach the far walls, but I could see structures in the darkness, formations that looked organic rather than geological. They resembled massive ribs, curved supports arching up from the floor and disappearing into the ceiling, arranged in regular intervals. The rock between them was different, thinner, almost translucent in places, and it pulsed with that steady rhythm. I approached one of the rib-like structures and examined it closely. It was rock, definitely granite composition. But the formation pattern made no geological sense. Granite forms from cooling magma, creating random crystalline structures. This was organized, deliberate, shaped by forces that had nothing to do with volcanic activity. I touched it and felt warmth, felt the pulse, felt something else, a response, like the structure was aware I'd made contact. My Geiger counter spiked suddenly, readings jumping to levels that were dangerous even with protective equipment. I backed away from the structure and the reading dropped. I approached again, same spike. The radiation wasn't coming from the rock itself. It was a response to proximity, like the mountain was trying to drive me away, with emissions it could somehow control. I heard the breathing change. The 17-second interval shortened to 15 seconds, then 12. The pulsing in the walls accelerated. The temperature increased noticeably, and the air pressure began to fluctuate. Whatever I'd awakened or disturbed was reacting to my presence. I made the decision to evacuate immediately. I ran back through the tunnels, following my marked route, monitoring my dosimeter, which was accumulating exposure faster than it should. The breathing sounds followed me, growing louder, the intervals continuing to shorten. The tunnel walls were contracting noticeably now, the rhythmic pulses strong enough to shake loose rock from the ceiling. I was being pushed out, expelled like a foreign object the mountain's immune system had detected. I reached the cavity where I'd first entered, scrambled through the broken seal into the mining tunnels, and didn't stop running until I was back at the surface. The exposed ore around the mine entrance was glowing faintly, visible even in daylight, pulsing in rapid rhythm. I grabbed my satellite phone and called my supervisor, but the connection was overwhelmed with interference. That same rhythmic pattern, now transmitted as electronic noise. I evacuated the site completely, hiked back to the boat access point, and didn't file my report until I was back in Ketchikan with full cellular service. I documented everything I'd observed, included all the data, all the measurements, all the anomalies. I recommended the site be sealed immediately and classified as too unstable for remediation work. The Forest Service reviewed my findings and brought in additional geologists. They surveyed the accessible tunnels but didn't find the broken seal I'd removed. It had been repaired, fresh concrete that couldn't possibly have cured in the 3 days since I'd left the site. They found no evidence of the deeper cavities. No unusual temperature readings, no radiation pulses. Their equipment showed everything within normal parameters for an abandoned uranium mine. They suggested I'd experienced equipment malfunction combined with the psychological stress of working alone in a radioactive environment. It was a reasonable explanation. I wanted to believe it, but I still have the rock samples I collected from that deep cavity, and they still pulse with warmth every 17 seconds. I've measured them hundreds of times. The rhythm never varies, and when I hold them, I can feel something vast and patient, something that's been sleeping in the deep places beneath Alaska's mountains for longer than human civilization, something that mining operations disturbed but didn't wake, something that's still down there, breathing steadily, waiting. The remediation project was approved and began in late 2024. Workers are currently filling the open pit and sealing the tunnel entrances. But they're only closing the sections that humans dug, the shallow intrusions we made into the mountain's outer skin. The deeper cavities, the spaces where something lives and breathes. Those remain untouched because officially they don't exist. And every 17 seconds, whether anyone's measuring it or not, the mountain inhales and exhales. Radiation levels pulse in synchronized rhythm. And whatever sleeps beneath Boken Mountain continues its patient existence, undisturbed by the small creatures sealing shut the tiny wounds we carved into its surface. I took the volunteer maintenance position at Cape Sarishef Lighthouse because I needed the isolation. 26 years in the Coast Guard, most of it on cutters in the Bering Sea. And I'd reached the point where I couldn't handle crowds anymore. Couldn't sleep without the sound of water. Couldn't function in the noise and chaos of civilian life after retirement. When the Coast Guard automation program converted most Alaska lighthouses to unmanned operations, they still needed people for seasonal maintenance. 2-week rotations where you lived on site, performed equipment checks, cleaned solar panels, verified beacon operation, and made sure the automated systems kept running through the brutal Aleutian weather. It was perfect for someone like me, who needed purpose without people. Cape Sarishef sits on the northwestern tip of Unimak Island, the first major island in the Aleutian chain. The lighthouse has been operating since 1904, warning ships away from some of the most dangerous waters in the North Pacific. The current structure is a 50-foot concrete tower with attached keepers' quarters, fully automated since 1979, but requiring regular human maintenance to deal with the extreme weather conditions. October and November are typically the worst months. Constant storms rolling in from the Pacific, winds that regularly exceed 60 miles per hour, temperatures hovering just above freezing with precipitation that switches between rain, sleet, and snow, sometimes within the same hour. I arrived on October 19th via helicopter from Cold Bay. The pilot barely able to land in the wind before dropping me and my supplies and immediately lifting off again. The previous maintenance keeper had left detailed notes. All systems operational, minor weather damage to one solar panel array that I'd need to repair, generator fuel topped off. Everything looked standard. The quarters were small but adequate. One bedroom, kitchen area, communication room with VHF radio and satellite internet for weather updates and emergency contact. The lighthouse itself rose directly from the living quarters. A ladder leading up to the lamp room where the automated beacon rotated every 10 seconds, throwing its beam 20 miles across the dark Pacific waters. The first 3 days were routine. I performed equipment checks, repaired the damaged solar panel, cleaned salt spray off windows and lenses, monitored weather forecasts. A major storm system was approaching, expected to hit around day 5 of my rotation. Normal for this location, nothing concerning. The beacon operated perfectly, its million candle power light cutting through fog and darkness with mechanical precision. At night, I could see the beam sweep across the water from the quarters' windows, watch it illuminate walls of rain and spray, see it reflect off the low-hanging clouds. On the 4th night, I noticed something in the water beyond the light's reach. Dark shapes, large ones, moving just outside the illuminated area. At first I thought they were whales. Humpbacks and orcas are common in these waters. But the movement was wrong. Whales surface and dive in predictable patterns. These shapes were circling, maintaining a consistent distance from shore, staying just beyond where the lighthouse beam reached. I watched them for an hour, tracking their movement. They completed perfect circles around the lighthouse, never coming closer, never moving away, just circling in the darkness. I checked the marine mammal identification guides. Nothing matched what I was seeing. The shapes were too large for seals or sea lions, wrong movement patterns for whales, too coordinated for a school of fish. I made notes in my log but didn't report it. There was nothing concrete to report, just shapes in dark water that could have been a dozen different things. But I felt uneasy in a way my Coast Guard experience recognized. Something was testing the perimeter, learning the patterns, and that meant trouble even if I didn't understand what kind yet. The storm hit on day 6, coming in hard with sustained winds at 70 miles per hour and gusts exceeding 90. The lighthouse was built to withstand this. The concrete tower had survived over a century of Aleutian storms. The beacon kept rotating, kept throwing its light out into the chaos of wind and rain and spray. But now I could see them clearly. The shapes in the water were closer, much closer, no longer circling but converging on the lighthouse in straight lines. And they weren't marine mammals. They were roughly humanoid in basic shape, vertical orientation, appendages that might have been arms or flippers, but scaled up massively. Each one was easily 20 feet tall when they stood in the shallow water near shore. Their skin, if it was skin, reflected the lighthouse beam in ways that reminded me of deep-sea fish, bioluminescent properties that seemed to respond to external light. When the beam swept across them, they lit up, patterns of light rippling across their forms like signals or communication. I watched from the lamp room as they approached the rocks at the lighthouse base. The wind was screaming, spray was coating everything. But these things moved through the storm like it didn't exist. They reached the rocks and stopped, standing in the surf, all of them facing the lighthouse, facing the light. There were dozens of them now, arranged in concentric rings around the tower, and they were all perfectly still. Watching the beacon rotate, watching the light sweep across them again and again. I tried the radio to report what I was seeing, but the storm was creating too much interference. The satellite internet was down, common during severe weather when the dish couldn't maintain orientation. I was alone with whatever these things were. and they showed no signs of leaving. I counted 47 individuals in the closest ring, more in the rings beyond. Hard to count accurately in the storm. Conditions and poor visibility. They'd been drawn by the light, attracted like moths to flame, and now they were gathering. The previous keeper's log had mentioned nothing like this. I checked the historical records stored in the communication room, reading through decades of lighthouse logs, looking for any reference to unusual sightings or unexplained phenomena. Most logs were routine: weather reports, maintenance notes, supply deliveries. But I found entries from 1954, written by a keeper named Morrison, that made my hands shake when I read them. November 3rd. Shapes in water again tonight. Counted over 60 this time. They came closer during the storm, stood watching the light for 6 hours before retreating. November 4th. Requested early relief. Supervisor denied. Weather too severe for transport. November 5th. They're learning. Today, 3 of them reached the tower base during daylight. They touched the concrete, testing it. November 6th. Cannot turn off the light. It's the only thing keeping them at bay. When the beam strikes them, they stop advancing. They're waiting for darkness. Morrison's final entry was dated November 8th. Maintained continuous operation for 72 hours. Generator nearly out of fuel. If the light fails, I don't know what will happen. They're pressed against the tower now, dozens of them waiting. I can hear them through the concrete. Sounds that aren't quite language, but aren't quite animal either. Emergency backup systems ready. Will not let the light go out. The log entries resumed 3 days later with a different keeper. No explanation for the gap, no mention of Morrison again. I searched the personnel records but found nothing about his fate or transfer. He'd simply disappeared from the documentation, replaced by someone who made no reference to anything unusual. I looked out the lamp room windows at the gathering below. The storm was intensifying, and more of them were emerging from the ocean, pulling themselves up onto the rocks, adding to the rings of watchers. They were closer now than Morrison had described. Close enough that I could see details when the light swept across them. Appendages that weren't quite arms or legs, features that suggested faces, but with too many angles. Proportions that hurt to look at directly. And they were making sounds, deep, resonant tones that I felt through the tower structure more than heard with my ears. The beacon continued its rotation, and I realized Morrison had been right. The light was keeping them back. When the beam struck them directly, they stopped moving, stopped approaching. They stood frozen in its illumination, only advancing again in the seconds of darkness between sweeps. They were timing it, learning the 10-second rotation pattern, figuring out how far they could move in each interval of darkness. I checked the fuel levels. The generator had plenty of reserve, and the solar batteries were fully charged despite the cloud cover. The light would keep operating for weeks if necessary. But the storm was getting worse, and I was watching these things learn, watching them adapt their strategy. Some of them had started moving laterally during the dark intervals, changing positions, testing different approaches to the tower. They were problem-solving, demonstrating intelligence that suggested they'd done this before, maybe many times, maybe for decades or longer. I went down to the keeper's quarters and barricaded the lower door that led outside, using furniture and equipment to create multiple layers of obstacles. The tower had been built to be secure. Thick concrete walls, minimal access points, heavy doors designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. But those doors had been designed to keep out weather, not determined entities that might be older than the lighthouse itself. Night 7. They began testing the structure. I felt vibrations through the floor as they pushed against the concrete, probing for weaknesses. The lighthouse shuddered with each impact, but held firm. The beacon kept rotating, kept sweeping its light across the growing mass of them. I counted over 200 now, and more were still emerging from the ocean. The sounds they made were constant. Those deep, resonant tones that seemed to carry meaning seemed to be coordinating the assault. I tried everything to call for help. The VHF radio was useless in the storm. The satellite phone wouldn't acquire a signal. The emergency beacon was transmitting, but there was no way to know if anyone was receiving it in these conditions. I was alone, surrounded by things that had learned over decades or centuries that the lighthouse attracted them, that the light was something they desired or needed or were compelled to approach. Night 8. The generator faltered. Just for 3 seconds. Just long enough for the beacon to dim and the backup batteries to engage. But in those 3 seconds, they surged forward. I felt the towers shake with their collective movement. Heard new sounds, scraping against concrete, impacts against the lower door, pressure being applied to every accessible surface. When the generator stabilized and the beacon returned to full power, they retreated slightly, but not all the way. They'd gained ground, established a new perimeter closer to the tower. I realized then what Morrison must have understood. This wasn't a siege I could outlast. They were patient. They'd been doing this for longer than human beings had been maintaining lighthouses. The light attracted them, but it also held them back, creating a perfect equilibrium where they gathered but couldn't quite reach their goal. And that goal was inside the tower, was me or any other living thing that maintained the beacon, that drew them from whatever deep trenches they normally inhabited. Night 9. I made the decision to maintain constant watch in the lamp room, never descending to the quarters, keeping eyes on the beacon operation every second. I couldn't risk another generator fluctuation, couldn't allow even momentary darkness. I set up emergency protocols, manual backup lighting, flares, every possible light source positioned and ready. Because I understood now that darkness meant death, that these things had learned over countless attempts that the only time they could reach the tower's interior was when the light failed. The storm began to ease on night 10. The wind dropped to 40 miles per hour, the rain became intermittent, visibility improved. And that's when I saw what they'd been doing while I focused on the beacon. They'd been building, using rocks from the shore, debris from the ocean, materials I couldn't identify. They'd constructed a ramp or platform that extended from the water's edge toward the tower base, raising their approach angle, creating a path that would put them above the lighthouse beam's coverage at ground level. They were adapting. They'd learned that the rotating beam had a blind spot directly beneath it, a cone of shadow at the tower base that the overhead light couldn't illuminate. If they could reach that spot, they could work on the tower structure in darkness, could undermine it or break through it without the light stopping them. It was engineering, problem-solving at a level that proved these weren't animals or simple creatures. They were intelligent, patient, and they'd been studying this structure for decades, learning from each attempt, refining their strategy. Night 11. The helicopter was supposed to arrive for my extraction. The storm had passed, weather was clear enough for flight. But when I tried the radio at the scheduled contact time, I got no response. I tried the satellite phone, same result. The emergency beacon was transmitting, but no one was acknowledging. I checked all my equipment. Everything was functional. The signals were going out. But nothing was coming back. I looked out at the ocean and saw why. They'd surrounded the lighthouse completely, hundreds of them, and when they stood together, they created a wall of mass and energy that might have been interfering with communications, might have been deliberately blocking my signals, They wanted me isolated, wanted to ensure no rescue would come while they executed whatever plan they'd been building toward. Night 12. I rationed my food and water, preparing for an extended siege. The light kept rotating, kept holding them at bay, but their ramp construction was nearly complete. By my estimate, they'd reach the blind spot beneath the tower within another day. I had to make a choice. Maintain the light and let them reach the tower base, or turn off the light and try to escape while they were disoriented by darkness. Both options were desperate. Both probably fatal. I chose to maintain the light. It was my duty as the keeper, even a temporary one, to ensure the beacon kept operating. Ships depended on it. Navigation systems referenced it. Lives were saved by its continuous operation. Couldn't abandon that responsibility just because something from the deep ocean had decided to gather here. Morrison hadn't let the light fail. Neither would I. Night 13. Their ramp reached the tower. I watched from above as the first of them climbed into the blind spot directly beneath me. I could hear them working, could feel vibrations as they did something to the concrete foundation. The light kept rotating above them, useless to stop what was happening in the shadow cone it created. I prepared my final report, documenting everything I'd observed, uploading it to the satellite system with instructions to transmit automatically if communications were restored. Then I took every light source I had, flashlights, lanterns, flares, and positioned them in the stairwell leading up to the lamp room. When they breached the lower door, as I knew they eventually would, they'd have to climb through layers of light to reach me. It wouldn't stop them, but it would slow them, would let me maintain my duty of keeping the lighthouse beacon operational for as long as possible. That's what keepers do. We maintain the light. We warn ships away from danger. We don't abandon our posts, not for storms, not for isolation, not for things that come from the ocean depths drawn by the very light we're sworn to keep burning. The helicopter found me on day 16. The storm had prevented earlier rescue, and when they finally reached Cape Sarychev, they found me in the lamp room, surrounded by dead batteries and burned-out bulbs, the beacon still rotating on its automated system. I was severely dehydrated, hypothermic, and according to the rescue report, experiencing severe hallucinations from isolation and stress. They found no evidence of forced entry, no damage to the lower door, no ramp structure on the rocks. Everything was normal except for me. But they didn't explain the deep gouges in the concrete at the tower base, marks that suggested massive force applied by something with incredible strength. They didn't explain why every window in the keeper's quarters had been shattered from the outside. And they didn't explain the organic residue on the rocks around the lighthouse, material that field analysis couldn't identify, that didn't match any known marine species. They attributed it to storm damage and my unreliable testimony. I'm not cleared for lighthouse duty anymore. Medical retirement, they called it, with full benefits and a recommendation for ongoing psychiatric care. But I watched the Cape Sarychev beacon status remotely through the Coast Guard systems, and I see the automated reports. Every October, every November, the lighthouse records increased power consumption, like something is requiring the beacon to work harder, to shine brighter, to maintain its warning against whatever gathers in the darkness beyond its reach, drawn to the light but held back by it. Waiting for the moment when the machinery fails and the beam goes dark and they can finally claim what they've been seeking for longer than anyone remembers. I've been mushing competitively for 8 years, completed the Yukon Quest twice, finished mid-pack in shorter races across 3 states. The Iditarod was my goal race, the one every serious musher dreams about. 1,049 miles from Anchorage to Nome, across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. I'd trained for 2 years, assembled a team of 12 exceptional dogs, mapped every checkpoint, studied weather patterns, memorized the trail sections that claimed the most rookie mooshers. I thought I was prepared for anything the race could throw at me. I wasn't prepared for mile 473. The race started strong. My team was running well, hitting our planned pace, making good time through the early checkpoints. We'd crossed the Alaska Range without incident, navigated the Dalzell Gorge safely, made it through the Buffalo Tunnels and onto the interior trail sections. By day 5, we were approaching the stretch between Cripple and Ruby, a relatively straightforward section that shouldn't have presented any unusual challenges. Weather was cold but clear, maybe -15 with light wind. Perfect mooshing conditions. Mile 473 is marked by a distinctive frozen spruce tree. Lightning struck years ago, dead white wood twisted into a shape that looks almost like a reaching hand. Every musher knows it from the trail descriptions, uses it as a landmark for the straightaway that follows. I passed that tree at 2:47 p.m., according to my GPS watch. The dogs were running steady, tongues out, tails up, showing none of the fatigue signs I was monitoring for. My lead dog, Kodiak, had his ears forward, focused and confident. We had maybe 40 miles to the next checkpoint where I'd planned a 4-hour rest. The trail ahead was flat and wide, following a frozen creek bed through sparse black spruce forest. Visibility was excellent. I could see at least a mile ahead. I settled into the rhythm of the sled, checking the dog's gaits, watching for any signs of injury or stress, mentally calculating our arrival time at Ruby. Standard racing routine. Then I passed the lightning-struck tree again. I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe there was another similar tree, another landmark that looked like the one at mile 473. But my GPS showed I'd traveled 3.2 miles since the last checkpoint. I should have been well past that tree, should have been seeing different terrain. I looked back over my shoulder and saw the trail stretching behind me, clear sled tracks in the snow showing the path I'd just traveled. When I looked forward again, the tree was there, that distinctive twisted shape, and my GPS reset to show mile 473, and my watch showed 2:47 p.m. I stopped the team, set my snow hook, and checked all my equipment. GPS could malfunction. Satellites could lose signal in the Alaska interior, especially near mountains. My watch could have glitched, reset to an earlier time. But when I checked my race tracker, the one that transmitted my position to race officials, it also showed mile 473. I called out to the dogs, got them moving again, pushed past the tree, watching my GPS carefully. The mileage counted up, 473.1, 473.2, 473.3. My watch advanced normally, 248, 249, 250. I traveled what my GPS said was 4 miles. The terrain changed appropriately, slight rise, then descent, the creek bed widening, forest density increasing. Then I came around a gentle curve and saw the tree again. The lightning-struck spruce at mile 473. My GPS showed 477.1 miles, but I was looking at the marker that shouldn't appear for another 4 miles of backtracking. My watch still read 2:50 p.m. The dogs were still running strong, showing no signs that anything unusual was happening. But I'd been mushing for what felt like 15 minutes, and the equipment said I'd traveled 4 miles. Yet I was back at the same landmark I'd passed twice before. I stopped again, this time for longer. I fed the dogs, checked their feet, ran my hands over their shoulders and backs, feeling for any indication of stress or injury. They were fine, perfect condition, acting exactly as they should after a moderate run. But something was deeply wrong with either my perception or the environment, or both. I tried my satellite communicator to contact race officials. The device powered on, showed full signal strength. But when I tried to send a message, it failed. Not no signal or message sending. Just failed. Like the message was transmitted into nowhere. I made the decision to keep going. Stopping wouldn't solve whatever was happening, and the dogs needed to maintain their routine. I pulled the snow hook and got them moving, this time paying extremely close attention to every detail of the terrain. I memorized specific trees, noted the exact positions of stumps and rocks, watched for any indication that I was actually traveling in a circle, despite the trail appearing straight. 23 minutes by my watch, 3.8 miles by my GPS, and I passed the lightning-struck tree again. The fourth time broke something in my calm assessment of the situation. I was trapped in a loop, traveling forward but somehow returning to the same point, time progressing but resetting, distance accumulating but proving meaningless. I checked the dogs again and noticed something I'd missed before. Kodiak's right ear had a small notch of ice that had formed from his breath, freezing on the fur. I'd noticed it an hour ago and made a mental note to check it at our next stop. But the ice notch was larger now, more developed, like hours had passed instead of minutes. I checked my other dogs, similar signs of extended exertion. Snow packed between their pads deeper than it should be for the distance we'd supposedly traveled. Their breathing rates slightly elevated beyond what the current pace should produce. The dogs were experiencing real time, real distance. My equipment was showing one version of reality, but their bodies were telling a different story. We'd been running for longer than the GPS and watch indicated. How much longer, I couldn't calculate. I pulled out my backup watch, the analog one I carried for emergencies. It showed 4:35 p.m., nearly 2 hours different from my digital watch. I'd entered this section at 2:47 p.m., and if the analog watch was correct, I'd been running the loop for almost 2 hours, experiencing subjective time as maybe 20-minute intervals. I tried deliberately going off trail, steering the sled into the forest away from the established race route. The dogs followed my commands, and we pushed into deeper snow between the trees. I traveled what felt like 10 minutes, putting significant distance between us and the trail. Then the forest opened up, and I was back on the trail, approaching the lightning-struck tree from the same direction I'd been traveling all along. Like the detour had never happened or had somehow curved back, despite me maintaining a straight compass heading. Panic was starting to override rational thinking. I forced myself to breathe, to approach this like any other race challenge. I fed the dogs again, gave them water from my thermos, checked equipment systematically. Then I noticed the dog food bag. I'd fed them what should have been 2 snacks from our supplies. But the bag was nearly empty, showing consumption consistent with a full day of feeding rather than 2 small portions. Time was passing at normal rates. My supplies confirmed it. The dog's physical condition confirmed it. But I was experiencing it in compressed loops, reliving the same section of trail while hours actually elapsed. I tried running the loop differently, varying my speed, stopping at different points, calling different commands to the dogs. Each variation felt like it should break the pattern, but every attempt ended the same way. Passing the lightning-struck tree, GPS reading mile 473, digital watch reading 2:47 p.m. The analog watch kept advancing. 5:12 p.m., 5:48 p.m., 6:23 p.m. By the analog watch's time, I'd been trapped for over 3 hours, living and reliving what felt like 20-minute segments. The sun was getting lower, which confirmed real time was passing. At this latitude in March, sunset was around 7:30 p.m. The light was definitely dimming toward evening despite my digital watch insisting it was still mid-afternoon. The dogs were tiring, real fatigue from real hours of running. I made the decision to stop for an extended rest at the next reset, to let them recover and to think through options more carefully. When I passed the tree again, I set a solid camp. Snow hook driven deep, sleeping bag rolled out on the sled, stove lit for melting water. The dogs dropped into resting positions immediately, which told me they'd been working far harder than my perception suggested. I documented everything in my trail journal, every loop I could remember, every equipment reading, every observation. If I didn't make it out, maybe someone would find the journal and understand what happened here. As I wrote, I noticed my handwriting changing across the entries. The first note was neat and controlled. The subsequent entries became more erratic, words misspelled, sentences incomplete. I was deteriorating, losing coherence with each loop, even though I felt mentally clear. The journal provided objective evidence that I was experiencing cognitive decline, that whatever was causing the temporal distortion was affecting my mind in ways I couldn't directly perceive. I rested for what my watch said was 30 minutes, but what felt like 2 hours. The dogs slept hard, the kind of deep rest they showed after full days of racing. When I packed up and started moving again, it was fully dark. Headlamp necessary, stars visible, temperature dropping into the -20s. But when I passed the tree, it was daylight again, 2:47 p.m. The sun in the same position it had been hours earlier. The loop had reset light conditions along with time. I lost count of repetitions. 10, 15, maybe 20 times passing that tree. The analog watch advanced. 8:47 p.m., 10:14 p.m., 11:39 p.m. The dogs were exhausted, running on pure training and habit. I should have stopped, should have made camp and waited for rescue, but something in the loop wouldn't let me stay still. Every time I tried to camp for more than brief rests, I'd find myself back on the moving sled, the dogs running, approaching the tree again with no memory of breaking camp. Then I noticed the other mushers. Shapes in the distance, headlamps bobbing in the darkness, other teams running the same section of trail. I tried calling out to them, but they didn't respond, didn't acknowledge my presence. I pushed my team faster, trying to catch up, to make contact with another person who might help me understand what was happening. But the distance never closed. They stayed always the same, far ahead. Visible, but unreachable. The analog watch read 2:33 a.m. when I finally understood. I'd been seeing myself, seeing my own team at different points in the loop, different iterations of the same passage existing simultaneously in the same space. The temporal distortion wasn't just affecting my perception. It was layering multiple instances of the same events on top of each other. I was running parallel to my own past and future attempts to navigate this section. I made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to continue forward, I turned the team around. "Ha!" I called, steering them back the direction we'd come. The dogs responded immediately, turning the sled, reversing course. We traveled backward along my trail, following my own sled tracks in the snow. Behind me, I could see the lightning-struck tree receding. My GPS started counting down. Mile 472.8, 472.5, 472.1. When I reached what my GPS showed as mile 469, I turned the team around again and headed forward once more. This time, when we approached mile 473, I steered the sled deliberately off trail at a sharp angle, avoiding the tree entirely by moving through forest 50 yards to the side. The dogs struggled in the deeper snow, the sled caught on hidden stumps, but I kept them angled away from the established trail. We broke through into clear trail on the other side of the tree. My GPS jumped, showing mile 479.4. My digital watch reset, now showing 3:52 p.m., a full hour ahead of where it had been stuck. The analog watch read 3:15 a.m. I'd lost over 12 hours in that loop, compressed into what I'd experienced as maybe 3 hours of conscious time. I didn't stop to analyze what happened. I pushed the dogs forward, putting distance between us and that section of trail. They ran willingly despite their exhaustion, maybe sensing my urgency or maybe experiencing their own relief at escaping whatever had trapped us. 20 miles later, we reached the Ruby checkpoint at 6:47 a.m., according to race officials, which matched neither of my watches, but fell somewhere between their conflicting times. The checkpoint veterinarian examined my dogs and found them severely fatigued, consistent with running for 16 hours straight rather than the 8 hours since our last checkpoint. My mandatory rest was extended, and officials questioned why I'd pushed the team so hard. I couldn't explain. How could I describe being trapped in a temporal loop when all the evidence suggested I just mushed straight through, ignoring rest protocols, endangering my dogs through poor race management? I scratched from the race at Ruby. My dogs were medically cleared but needed recovery time I couldn't provide while continuing. The official record shows I made poor decisions on the trail between Cripple and Ruby, resulting in overexertion of my team. There's no mention of time distortions or spatial loops. No other musher reported unusual experiences in that section. My GPS and satellite tracker data shows a continuous journey with no interruptions, though there's a corrupted section of the log file that officials attributed to equipment malfunction. I still have both watches. The digital one stopped working the day I left Ruby, frozen at 3:52 p.m. The analog one keeps perfect time. And I still have my trail journal, with those deteriorating entries showing cognitive decline that matches no other experience I've had before or since. Sometimes I read through them, trying to understand what I was experiencing, that my handwriting could become so erratic while I felt mentally clear. The race officials asked if I wanted to return next year, try again with a new team. I declined. 8 years of competitive mushing ended on that section of trail between checkpoints, in those lost hours at mile 473. Other mushers still run that route every March, passing that lightning-struck tree without incident, continuing on to Ruby and eventually to Nome. But I know what's there, know that under certain conditions, specific weather, specific time, specific circumstances I can't identify. The trail folds back on itself, and time becomes a loop you can't escape by moving forward. Only by breaking the pattern entirely and accepting the disorientation that follows. My dogs recovered fully. Kodiak is retired now, living with me, sleeping by the wood stove. Sometimes I watch him dream, watch his legs twitch like he's running. And I wonder if he's back on that trail, running that same section over and over in his sleep, trapped in a loop that exists in memory, even if we escaped it in reality. I've been conducting archaeological surveys in Alaska for 9 years. Most of that time focused on documenting pre-contact indigenous sites before coastal erosion and permafrost degradation destroyed them permanently. Climate change has accelerated the thawing process, exposing artifacts and remains that have been frozen for centuries or millennia. It's a race against time. Document and preserve what we can before it's lost forever. The site near the abandoned Yupik village of Unexplained was supposed to be straightforward summer fieldwork. We'd been invited by the regional native corporation to assess and document cultural materials exposed by recent erosion along the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. What we found there wasn't archaeology. It was a warning we should have heeded. The site was accessible only by bush plane, a 40-minute flight from Bethel to a gravel strip near the old village location. Nunaklik had been abandoned in the 1950s during the village consolidation period, when many small settlements were relocated to larger communities with schools and services. The structures were long gone, collapsed and reclaimed by tundra, but the location remained significant to the Yupik people as an ancestral site. Our team consisted of 6 people. Myself as lead archaeologist, 2 graduate students, a cultural liaison from the Native Corporation, a photographer, and a field technician. We had permits, community support, and a detailed research plan approved by all relevant authorities. The erosion exposure was on a bluff overlooking the Bering Sea, where storm surge and wave action had cut back the shoreline by nearly 30 feet in the past 5 years. The permafrost face showed clear stratigraphy, layers of soil, organic material, and cultural deposits visible in cross-section like a timeline you could read vertically. We'd expected to find typical archaeological materials: stone tools, pottery fragments, food remains, maybe structural features like house pits or storage caches. What we found in the lowest, oldest layer was a mass burial that had been deliberately preserved in permafrost. There were 7 bodies, arranged in a circular pattern, bound with braided sinew rope that had survived the freezing process. Each body was wrapped in hide that still showed painted symbols, geometric patterns and stylized animal forms that our cultural liaison identified as very old Yupik designs, pre-Russian contact, possibly predating any recorded oral histories. The bodies themselves were extraordinarily well preserved, skin and soft tissue intact, facial features recognizable. But there were details that immediately struck everyone as unusual. The binding wasn't ceremonial. It was restraint. The rope around wrists and ankles showed evidence of struggle, wear patterns suggesting the individuals had been bound while alive. And their mouths had been sewn shut with sinew thread, dozens of careful stitches that sealed the lips completely. Our cultural liaison, a Yupik elder named Paul Naneng, went very quiet when he saw them. He asked us to stop work immediately, said we needed to consult with elders from the regional villages before proceeding. I should have listened. Standard archaeological practice when dealing with human remains on native lands is to follow community guidance, to respect cultural protocols even when they conflict with research timelines. But I was focused on the scientific significance, on the exceptional preservation, on the unique binding patterns that could tell us something important about pre-contact mortuary practices. I convinced Paul to let us document the exposure before covering it, promised we'd halt excavation until proper consultations were completed. He agreed reluctantly, making it clear he thought we were making a serious mistake. We photographed everything, took measurements, collected samples of the binding materials and surrounding soil for dating analysis. The permafrost had kept everything frozen solid, but summer temperatures were warm enough that exposed materials began thawing as we worked. One of my graduate students, Melissa, noticed that one of the bodies, a female, judging by the clothing and body structure, had something in her mouth behind the sewn-shut lips. We carefully removed a few stitches to examine it and found a carved ivory object, maybe 3 inches long, covered in incised marks that might have been writing or symbolic notation. We documented it in place, then extracted it for closer analysis. That night, back at our camp about half a mile from the excavation site, Paul told us what the village elders had told him growing up. The area around Nunaklik had been deliberately abandoned long before the 1950s relocation, he said. The old name for the location translated roughly as the place where they were put down. And there were stories about people who had become possessed by something from the sea, something that made them dangerous to others, that couldn't be killed but could be bound and frozen to prevent them from causing harm. The stories were vague, oral traditions filtered through generations and cultural changes. But the core message was consistent. Certain individuals had been deliberately restrained and placed in permafrost as a form of containment, not burial. The sewn-shut mouths were meant to prevent them from speaking, from passing the possession to others through words or breath. I listened politely, but dismissed it as folklore. the kind of cultural mythology that develops around unusual burial practices. Every culture has stories to explain ancient customs whose original meanings have been lost. I was more interested in the physical evidence, the binding techniques, the preservation methods, the ivory object with its mysterious inscriptions. I stayed up late that night, examining it under magnification, photographing the incised marks, trying to identify patterns that might indicate language or symbolic representation. The dreams started that night. All 6 of us had them, though we didn't discuss it until the following day. Vivid, disturbing dreams of drowning, of cold water filling lungs, of something vast and dark moving beneath ice-covered seas. I dreamed I was one of the bound individuals, conscious but unable to move, unable to speak, feeling the permafrost creeping through my body, freezing me cell by cell, while some other consciousness shared my trapped mind. I woke gasping, actually cold despite the summer temperatures and my sleeping bag. Over breakfast, the others mentioned their dreams, similar themes, variations on drowning and freezing and being trapped with something else, inhabiting their thoughts. Paul said nothing, just looked at each of us with an expression I couldn't quite read. Later, he told me we needed to rebury the remains immediately, needed to perform specific rituals to restore the containment. I told him we'd consult with the university's repatriation committee, follow proper legal procedures for handling indigenous remains. He shook his head and said legal procedures weren't going to help with what we'd released. On day 3, the temperature anomalies began. The excavation site was noticeably colder than the surrounding area. We measured 10 degrees difference between the exposure face where the bodies were and the tundra 50 feet away. Permafrost doesn't work like that. If anything, exposed permafrost warms up as it thaws, doesn't maintain lower temperatures than insulated ground. We checked our thermometers, verified the readings multiple times. The cold was real and intensifying, creating a microclimate around the burial site that shouldn't have been physically possible. Melissa started acting strangely. She'd been the most enthusiastic about the excavation, spent the most time in direct contact with the remains during documentation. She became withdrawn, spent long periods staring at the bodies, specifically at the female whose mouth we'd opened to retrieve the ivory object. When we asked if she was okay, she responded in a flat monotone completely unlike her normal animated speech patterns. She said she was fine, just tired. But her eyes were wrong, unfocused, distant, like she was looking through us rather than at us. That afternoon, Paul found her at the excavation site alone, kneeling in front of the exposed bodies, speaking to them in a language he recognized as very archaic Yupik, dialects that hadn't been commonly spoken in over a century. She had no training in Yupik languages, had never studied the linguistic history of the region. When he tried to get her attention, she didn't respond, just kept speaking in that ancient dialect, her voice taking on tonal qualities that didn't sound quite human. We brought her back to camp, and she seemed to snap out of it, claimed she didn't remember going to the site or speaking any language other than English. But the rest of us noticed she'd started, unconsciously mimicking behaviors. She'd scratch her wrist exactly when Paul scratched his, shift her weight the same moment I did, mirror our movements with unsettling precision. And she was cold to the touch, her skin temperature several degrees below normal despite showing no signs of hypothermia. The second graduate student, David, developed similar symptoms by evening. The photographer, Jennifer, by midnight. Each of them spent time at the exposure, each had direct contact with the remains or the artifacts we'd collected, and each began exhibiting the same progression: withdrawal, flat effect, unconscious mimicry of others, lowered body temperature, and periods of speaking archaic Yupik without conscious knowledge of the language. Paul and I were the only team members not affected, and the technician, Marcus, was showing early signs. Paul said it was because we'd been most cautious about direct contact, had respected basic protocols about handling remains, even if we hadn't followed his advice about reburial. He said the possession, because that's what it was, he insisted, not psychological contagion or environmental exposure, transferred through physical contact with the bodies or through prolonged proximity to them. The binding and freezing had contained it, but we'd broken the containment by removing stitches, by handling the remains, by warming them with our presence and documentation equipment. I finally accepted that we were dealing with something outside normal archaeological experience. Whether it was genuine possession or some kind of pathogen preserved in permafrost that affected neurological function, the result was the same. My team was compromised, and standard scientific protocols weren't helping. I agreed to Paul's plan. We'd rebury the remains with proper rituals, reseal the containment as much as possible, and evacuate the affected team members for medical evaluation. We worked through the night, Paul performing ceremonies I didn't understand, speaking words in Yupik that he said were very old protective formulas passed down through specific family lines. We carefully reburied the 7 bodies exactly as we'd found them, replaced the disturbed permafrost and soil, marked the location with cairns built according to Paul's specifications. The affected team members stood watching the entire process, perfectly still, perfectly silent, their expressions blank, but their eyes tracking our movements with disconcerting intensity. When we finished the reburial and Paul completed his final prayers, the 3 affected team members collapsed simultaneously. We checked their vital signs, breathing, heartbeat, temperature all normal now, and they regained consciousness within minutes. None of them remembered anything after their initial exposure at the excavation site. Melissa's last memory was photographing the bodies on day 2. David's last clear recollection was collecting soil samples. Jennifer remembered nothing after downloading her camera files. We evacuated the next day, flying everyone back to Bethel, where medical evaluation found nothing physically wrong with any of the team members. Neurological function normal, no infections, no toxins detected in blood work. The official explanation in our incident report was environmental stress and possible carbon monoxide exposure from our camp stove, though testing showed no elevated CO levels and the stove was functioning properly. I wrote the final site report emphasizing the need for extensive cultural consultation before any future work in the area, recommended the location be designated as culturally sensitive and restricted from archaeological investigation. The Native Corporation agreed and has since imposed permanent restrictions: no excavation, no research, minimal disturbance of any kind. The samples we collected, including the ivory object, were returned to the community and, according to Paul, were properly reburied with appropriate ceremonies. I haven't done field work in Alaska since. I tell people it's because of funding constraints or shifting research priorities. But the truth is, I can't trust my professional judgment anymore. I was so focused on scientific significance that I ignored clear warnings, dismissed cultural knowledge as superstition, and put my team in danger. The 3 affected students have no lasting effects physically, but all 3 eventually left archaeology. They say they don't remember what happened during those missing days, but sometimes I see something in their expressions that suggests otherwise. Suggests they remember exactly what it felt like to share consciousness with something that had been bound and frozen centuries ago to protect others from its influence. I still have the photographs from the site, the detailed documentation we compiled before the reburial. Sometimes I review them, looking at those 7 bound figures with their sewn-shut mouths, and I try to imagine what they were like before they became vessels for something else. Were they volunteers, sacrificing their own freedom to contain a threat? Were they victims, possessed against their will and restrained by their community? The Yupik elders won't discuss it in detail. Some knowledge, they say, is meant to remain with specific people who are trained to handle it safely. What I know for certain is that permafrost across Alaska is thawing at accelerating rates, exposing materials that have been frozen for thousands of years. Most of it is harmless archaeological material that needs documentation and preservation. But some of it, a very small fraction, was deliberately frozen, deliberately isolated, deliberately contained by people who understood dangers we've forgotten. And as the permafrost melts and exposes these ancient repositories, we're breaking containments we don't recognize, releasing things we don't understand, all in the name of scientific inquiry and cultural preservation. The archaeology community needs to develop new protocols, new respect for traditional knowledge about certain sites, new humility about our assumptions that everything frozen in time should be unfrozen and studied. Because sometimes our ancestors knew things we've forgotten, and they left warnings frozen in permafrost. Warnings we ignore at our own peril. I came to Alaska specifically for the auroras. After completing my doctorate in astrophysics at MIT, I accepted a research position at the University of Alaska Fairbanks Geophysical Institute, focusing on magnetospheric dynamics and auroral phenomena. The position included access to the Poker Flat Research Range and their sophisticated recording equipment, all sky cameras, magnetometers, photometers, everything necessary to study the complex interactions between solar wind and Earth's magnetic field. I'd spent 6 years preparing for this work, analyzing data from previous solar cycles, developing new mathematical models for predicting auroral intensity and behavior. I thought I understood the northern lights as well as anyone could. September 2024 taught me how catastrophically wrong I was. The solar maximum was approaching its peak, which meant increased auroral activity across high-latitude regions. My research focused on identifying patterns in auroral morphology, the shapes and structures the lights create as charged particles interact with atmospheric gases. Standard astrophysics held that these patterns were essentially random, determined by fluctuating solar wind conditions and the Earth's magnetic field topology. But I'd noticed something in historical data that suggested otherwise. When I analyzed decades of all-sky camera footage using pattern recognition algorithms, I found recurring structures that appeared with statistical frequency too high to be coincidental. I established a high-altitude observation facility about 40 miles north of Fairbanks, away from light pollution, equipped with recording equipment that operated continuously during the aurora season. The facility was small, just an insulated dome with computer systems, cameras, and basic living amenities for extended observation periods. I planned to spend the peak activity months living on site, recording every auroral display, building a comprehensive database of morphological patterns. The first significant display came on September 18th, just after the autumn equinox, when auroral activity statistically peaks. The lights that night were spectacular. Vivid greens and reds, curtains that rippled across the entire sky, corona formations directly overhead. I recorded everything at multiple wavelengths, capturing data that would take weeks to analyze properly. But while watching the real-time displays on my monitors, I noticed something unusual. Within the seemingly random dancing of the lights, there were brief moments, lasting maybe 2 or 3 seconds, where the patterns became geometrically precise. Perfect circles, exact spirals, angles that held mathematical relationships I recognized from my work in field topology. I isolated those sections and enhanced them, running them through spectral analysis and pattern matching software. The geometric forms weren't artifacts of the recording equipment. They were real structures in the aurora itself, lasting just long enough to be captured on high-speed cameras before dissolving back into apparently random motion. Over 6 hours of recording, I identified 47 instances of these precise geometric patterns. When I mapped their timing and positions, I found they followed a sequence, appearing in specific sky positions in an order that wasn't random. The next clear night, September 21st, I watched for the patterns specifically. They appeared again, different geometric forms, but following the same type of sequencing behavior. I began documenting them systematically, cataloging each shape, each position, each duration. After 2 weeks of observation, I had identified over 300 distinct geometric patterns, and I'd confirmed they repeated, not identically, but with variations that suggested something like language syntax, where basic elements combine in different ways to create meaning. I knew how it sounded. Astrophysicists don't discover languages in natural phenomena. Auroras are plasma physics, nothing more. Charged particles exciting atmospheric gases, producing photons at specific wavelengths determined by atomic structure. There's no mechanism for intentional patterning, no source of intelligence directing the displays. But the data was undeniable. The patterns were too complex, too structured, too consistent to be random fluctuations. I started trying to decode them. I approached it like cryptography, looking for frequency distributions, analyzing how patterns combined, searching for grammatical structures. Within days, I'd identified what appeared to be a fundamental alphabet of about 60 basic geometric forms that combined to create more complex structures. I found positional syntax. The same basic shape meant different things depending on where in the sky it appeared. I discovered temporal relationships. Patterns that appeared in sequence carried different information than the same patterns appearing simultaneously in different sky locations. October 3rd. I achieved what I thought was my first successful translation. A sequence of patterns repeated across multiple nights could be mapped to mathematical constants. Pi, Phi, the fine structure constant. It was basic communication, establishing common ground, proving that the patterns carried intentional information. I documented everything meticulously, prepared to submit findings to peer review despite knowing how controversial they'd be. I was excited, thinking I'd discovered something revolutionary about plasma physics or atmospheric dynamics that could create information-bearing structures. October 7th. The patterns became more complex. I was translating sequences that appeared to convey spatial information, coordinates, distances, dimensional relationships. But the dimensions described were wrong. The patterns suggested geometries that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, structures that required additional spatial dimensions to make mathematical sense. I checked my translations repeatedly. The mathematics was consistent, but it described impossible topologies. That's when I started having the headaches. Dull pressure behind my eyes that intensified whenever I worked on translations. I attributed it to eye strain, too many hours staring at monitors in the dark. But over-the-counter pain medication had no effect, and the pain only occurred when I was actively analyzing the auroral patterns, stopping completely when I took breaks. October 12th. I translated a complete sequence that lasted 47 minutes across a major auroral storm. The information was detailed, complex, and utterly terrifying. It described locations, not physical places, but conceptual spaces, regions of reality that existed outside normal causality. It provided coordinates using reference frames I couldn't fully understand. And it contained what I can only describe as an invitation. The patterns were calling, showing pathways, explaining how to access these impossible spaces. I stopped working on translations that night. I sat in the observation dome, watching the lights dance overhead. And I understood with absolute clarity that I was looking at communication from something that existed in dimensional spaces adjacent to our reality. The aurora wasn't creating these patterns. It was being used, modulated by intelligences that could manipulate magnetic fields and plasma flows the way we manipulate radio waves and electricity. The Earth's magnetosphere was a receiver, and the auroras were the output display, showing messages being transmitted through our reality for any consciousness capable of perceiving and understanding them. I should have destroyed my data and left. Professional ethics, survival instinct, basic sanity. Everything pointed towards stopping this research immediately. But the patterns had shown me things I couldn't unknown. I'd seen the mathematical structures underlying reality, glimpsed spaces where physical laws operated differently, understood that our three-dimensional existence was just one slice through a much larger manifold. The headaches intensified, but I kept working, kept translating, compelled by the same drive that makes people stare into depths they know are dangerous. October 18th. The aurora showed me my death. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. A sequence of patterns translated to information about my future, about choices I'd make, about the moment when understanding would exceed my neural architecture's capacity to contain it. The patterns showed this was inevitable for anyone who progressed far enough in translation. Human brains aren't structured to hold the kind of information the aurora transmits. We can perceive it, can partially understand it, but full comprehension requires cognitive architecture we don't possess. I experienced my first seizure that night. Grand mal, complete loss of consciousness, waking up on the dome floor with no memory of the event. My recording equipment showed I'd been unconscious for 17 minutes. During that time, the aurora had been displaying patterns I hadn't seen before. Complex geometries that covered the entire sky. When I reviewed the footage, trying to understand what had happened, I felt knowledge flooding into my consciousness. Not through translation work, but directly. The patterns somehow bypassing language and inserting information straight into my neural pathways. I knew things I had no right to know. Mathematical theorems that would take decades to prove through normal research. Physical constants for forces that don't operate in our dimensional space. The precise locations where reality is thinnest, where the barriers between dimensional manifolds break down and things can slip through. And I understood, with horrible clarity, that this knowledge was destroying me. That human consciousness can't contain information structured for minds that exist across multiple dimensional planes. The other researchers started noticing my deterioration. I'd lost weight, my speech patterns had changed. I'd begun speaking in mathematical notation during casual conversation. The institute director called me in for a wellness check, suggested I take leave, maybe get medical evaluation. I agreed to everything. Promised to schedule appointments, said I'd take time off. I had no intention of following through. The aurora had shown me something magnificent and terrible, and I needed to document it completely before the knowledge consumed me. October 24th. Second seizure, lasting 31 minutes. The aurora during that episode displayed patterns I can still see when I close my eyes. Geometric structures that exist in my visual cortex now, permanently burned into my neural architecture. When I regained consciousness, I'd written 17 pages of equations I had no memory of writing. Proofs for mathematical concepts that don't exist in any published literature. The handwriting deteriorated across the pages, becoming less controlled, more frantic. Finally dissolving into symbols that weren't quite mathematical notation and weren't quite language. I knew I was running out of time. The pattern was clear. Each exposure to the high-complexity sequences accelerated my cognitive breakdown. But the information was so valuable, so extraordinary, that I couldn't stop. I prepared a final recording session, set up automated systems to capture everything, and positioned myself for optimal viewing during the predicted major auroral storm on October 26th. The storm was the strongest of the season, KP index reaching 8, aurora visible as far south as Colorado. Here in the auroral zone, the entire sky was alive with light, moving so fast the human eye could barely track the motion. The patterns were everywhere, complex beyond anything I'd recorded before, showing me the complete structure of the message they'd been transmitting all along. It wasn't a communication meant for humanity. We were incidental observers. The aurora was a beacon, a lighthouse operating across dimensional boundaries, guiding things through the spaces between realities. And it was showing them where to find entry points, weak spots in the dimensional barriers where they could push through into our reality. Earth's magnetic field, the aurora itself, was a map and an invitation for intelligences that existed in geometries our minds couldn't properly comprehend. We'd been studying the northern lights for centuries, thinking they were just pretty displays of natural physics. But we were watching navigation instructions, approach vectors, entry coordinates being broadcast across the entire electromagnetic spectrum for anything capable of receiving the message. They found me 3 days later. University security, concerned when I missed meetings and wasn't responding to communications, drove out to the observation facility and found me unconscious in the dome, surrounded by pages of automatic writing and recordings of the October 26th storm playing on loop across all my monitors. Medical evaluation showed significant neurological damage, lesions in my visual cortex, abnormal activity in areas associated with spatial reasoning and mathematical processing. The official diagnosis was stroke, possibly multiple strokes brought on by stress and overwork. I know what really happened. I looked too long at patterns human neurology wasn't meant to process. I translated information structured for minds that think in dimensions we don't possess. And that information damaged me in ways modern medicine can't detect or treat. I'm writing this from a care facility, still lucid enough to document what I learned, though I know that lucidity is temporary. The patterns are still in my head, still unfolding, still showing me things about reality that consciousness shaped by three-dimensional evolution can't survive understanding. The aurora research continues at the Geophysical Institute. Other scientists study the lights, measure their intensity, model the plasma physics, and remain completely unaware that they're looking at the most dangerous information transmission ever aimed at Earth. Maybe that's better. Maybe human ignorance about what the aurora really represents is the only thing protecting us from trying to understand, from translating those patterns, from letting that knowledge into our minds where it doesn't fit and can't safely exist. But on clear winter nights, when the aurora is particularly active, I sometimes see reports from Alaska of people experiencing unusual symptoms, seizures, personality changes, speaking in languages they never studied, drawing geometric figures they can't explain. And I know they've looked too closely at the patterns. They've begun perceiving the information encoded in those dancing lights. And they're experiencing the same slow unraveling of human consciousness that comes from understanding things we were never meant to comprehend. The aurora will keep broadcasting. The patterns will keep dancing across Arctic skies. And occasionally someone with the right background and wrong curiosity will notice that the randomness isn't quite random, that geometric precision hides within the chaos. They'll start documenting, translating, understanding, and the knowledge will destroy them, just as it destroyed me. Because some information isn't meant for minds evolved in flat three-dimensional space. Some messages are meant for things that think in topologies we can't imagine. And intercepting those messages is the most dangerous research any human consciousness can pursue. Watch the aurora if you must. Photograph it, admire its beauty, appreciate the physics that creates such spectacular displays. But don't look for the patterns within the patterns. Don't try to find meaning in the precise geometries that appear for just a few seconds before dissolving. Don't translate what you find, because translation is acceptance. And acceptance means letting information structured for alien dimensional architectures into a human brain that has no capacity to contain it safely. Some things are beautiful precisely because we don't understand them. The aurora should remain one of those things. These 11 accounts from Alaska's wilderness represent just a fraction of the encounters that happen in the far north, where isolation and extreme conditions reveal things that remain hidden in more populated regions. If you found these stories unsettling, if they made you question what exists in the remote places humans rarely go, then subscribe to Verified Fears. Hit that notification bell, because the darkness holds more secrets than these 11 stories can contain. And the only way to prepare for what lurks in the unknown is to understand that the unknown is larger and stranger than we've ever imagined. Welcome to Verified Fears, where the stories are always verified and the fears are always real.